So that's tomorrow. Despite their considerable structural vulnerabilities, small island developing states have achieved incredible progress over the last 30 years. I was struck, for example, by Minister Regan Vanu's post last month that Vanuatu has achieved one of the biggest increases in life expectancy at birth over the last 30 years of any country in the world. And this is just one example, and we should pay more attention to these successes and the lessons from them. But the world is changing and global conditions are not favorable for SIDS, and we'll hear more on that later from our keynote speaker. To be successful, SIDS4 will need clear pathways for overcoming a range of challenges, from debt sustainability to decreasing productive capacity, increasingly devastating climatic impacts, and constraints in accessing climate finance needed to address all of these challenges. Any solutions that are put forward will need to be grounded in the best available science and good practice, and that's what we're here to talk about today. The structure of the day is around five thematic areas, which are outlined in the zero draft of the SIDS4 outcome document. And those 5 areas are resilient economies, safe and prosperous societies, a secure future, environmental protection and planetary sustainability, as well as means of implementation. Throughout the day and through these sessions, you'll be presented with evidence and examples of good practice and progress in SIDS, and you'll be asked to consider recommendations for overcoming obstacles and scaling up successes. I urge you all to participate actively in these sessions, to ask questions and share your own examples. The presentations from the academics are really just to kind of initiate the discussion. Hopefully, at some point during the day, you will have an aha moment where something will become clearer, where you'll see an opportunity for individual or collective action that could be a game changer for SIDS. If you do, make a note of it. Maybe send me a message, because by the end of today, we will hopefully have identified some critical pathways for resilient prosperity in SIDS. But that's not where this ends. Rather, it's where the hard work begins, because the success of SIDS4 lies in ensuring momentum along these pathways. So the SIDS agenda remains a global agenda for the next 10 years. So I'd like very much if we can check in again in 2 years' time, in 4 years' time, in 6 years' time, in 8 years' time, and come back to the ideas discussed today and assess progress, reflect on challenges, maybe reset the goals, and consider where course correction might be required. But before we go in depth into the thematic discussions, we have a set of opening remarks and reflections on previous SIDS agendas and expectations for the SIDS4 conference. And I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, who is Ambassador Walton Webson, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN. And Ambassador Webson is in Antigua at the moment preparing for the conference, so we have a pre-recorded message.
Thank you very much. Let me say again to everyone, good evening, good morning, and as you know, we are an interconnected world. It may even be in some places, good night. Let me apologize to all of you for not being present. I would love to have been present, but the work in preparation for the 4th SIDS conference have me away from New York at this time. But I am truly a part of the proceedings of this future forum. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants in this future forum conference or meeting, as we stand on the cusp of a transformative era, I am delighted for the convening of this future forum. I see this as a forerunner and as a complement to the 4th SIDS conference. Colleagues, I see this not just as a meeting, but as a moment for an interdisciplinary and exchanges of ideas as we chart the course towards resilience, prosperity. Amidst the backdrop and the challenges we face as small island developing states, the challenges of climate change, sustainable development, economic vulnerability, all of which weighs heavily on the backs of the development chart of small island developing states and the society. This Futures Forum can act as a beacon of hope, an opportunity of light for creating innovative ideas, and a testament towards our spirit as we chart towards a new course towards our survival as small island developing states in that battle towards a sustainable future. Friends, let us use this forum to proactively build on the outcome document drafted by the experts of our member states. This outcome document is a collective action document. It's a collection of the spirit and the will and the dedication of this group of experts. This document is a bridge towards the high-level meetings that will take place in Antigua and Barbuda in a few short months. The heart of these robust discussions, my friends, lies a progressive ethos and a new mentality towards the sharing and the cultural development of these islands. We see this new direction to be built into this new strategy for small island developing states over the next 10 years. We see your gathering here as an opportunity to be bold, to be frank, and it must encapsulate not only the adversities we face. That's almost a given. We know the challenges, but we think you must look at the opportunities that challenges bring, the new horizons and hope that can result from the solutions we will find in those challenges to which you will point to. My friends, small island states are not homogeneous. Each island is unique. Each island has its own environmental treasures, its own cultural uniqueness, but yet we have a common bond, and that is the oceans. That's why many of us are defined as small islands, but big ocean states. The ocean surrounds us. The air we breathe from this ocean, we believe, is a bond that binds us together. We have to look at the ocean as one of the engines that can bring about that collective action. Our voices must all be heard, big or small. We must give consideration to all voices that rises towards the new destiny for small island developing states. We see that the new strategy, which will be designed and developed out of SIDS 4, must be that moment that create the answers that those voices, small or big, will be raising and will bring to the table. As we prepare to be gathered in Antigua and Barbuda, SIDS 4 will design that manifesto for change and design that new syllabus for the future of these vulnerable island nations. This new SID agenda will be more than endurance. It will be about a vision, the conducting of a future where we, as small islands, will lead. We have been the moral voice for the globe. We have been the ones who have drawn the global attention to climate change. We believe that we will now create from SIDS 4 a future that we can be the leaders in sustainable development and environmental change. We must be that voice that can lead us into a new cultural experience. SIDS 4 is on the horizon. Let us, in this meeting, take the opportunity not just to think beyond the conference, but to think beyond the next strategy. To think that SIDS 4 must deliver on this new agenda. And your voices in this meeting can set that stage to set us on a course that is not only conceivable, but one that is really achievable. My friends, I leave you as you are the break of a new dawn, and SIDS 4 will be that first light of dawn that we will see, that will give the glimmer of hope for small island developing states. I thank you, and I wish you much success in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Ambassador Webson. I'm going to hand the floor now to the Undersecretary General of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the SG for the SIDS 4 conference, Lee Jin-hua, for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and also participants are on the line. Good morning from New York. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to address you at this first SIDS Future Forum. It is fitting that the timing of this meeting comes at a very critical moment when the international community is discussing the new 10-year SIDS program for action. The forum presents an opportunity for us to engage with the latest research and information and to think about the types of solutions needed to truly drive the development in SIDS. Your discussion here can help to identify the types of strategies and creative solutions needed to advance resilient prosperity in SIDS and inform the negotiating positions as we head into the 4th International Conference of SIDS. I take this opportunity to commend the Resilient and Sustainable Island Initiative organized and initiated by ODI for hosting this important event and for their consistent leadership in delivering research and evidence that inform the policy by and for SIDS. Initiatives such as this are among the many good examples of the external research practitioners' partnerships geared for the building internal capacity for the evidence-based decision-making in SIDS. Well, dear colleagues, dear friends, the issue to be covered in this meeting can all be found in the SIDS 4 draft outcome document, and all have the significant impacts on development trajectory for SIDS. SIDS resilience in adaptability and development will ultimately depend on the quality of the policies that are developed and implemented at the national, regional, and global levels. Success required governments to recommit to building and using evidence to improve the policy, program, budget, operational, and management decision-making, and to improve how national institutions do business. This also requires that the necessary analytical tools to measure outcomes and impacts are readily available. Identifying and investing in effective practices and transforming data into evidence that informs actions. All of this have the added benefit of the providing big, high-value jobs that cut across all aspects of the economy. A culture of the evidence must be at the core of any government's effort to achieve the resilience, prosperity, models of the excellence in the use of the evidence by SIDS must be expanded and scaled for greater success. Initiatives such as today's meeting allow us to pool our collective wisdom to devise strategies and sustainable solutions to the threats and the challenges that SIDS face. SIDS have established a solid foundation upon which to continue building. The stage is set, but we must continue to embrace innovation, ingenuity, and dynamism to secure and improve on the collective gains so far achieved by these countries. Let us move forward with a determination that is anchored in a strong foundation of the research, evidence, and the data to overcome today's challenges. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from the Chief of Service and Officer in charge of the Office of the High Representative for LDCs, least landlocked countries and SIDS, Mr. Erdene Bilek. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues, excellencies, and friends. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak at the SIDS Future Forum. This is a pivotal moment in the lead up to the SIDS conference to be held in Antigua Barbuda in May this year. I hope that the forum will deliver important directions in shaping the agenda for the next decade of development for small island developing states. The SIDS are confronted with multidimensional challenges. A recent UNCTAD report highlighted that SIDS are highly vulnerable to external economic and financial shocks, at least 35% more than other developing countries. This is primarily due to their small economies, heavy reliance on international trade, and limited export diversification. Moreover, access to concessional finance remains a pressing issue for small island developing states, further complicating their efforts to implement sustainable development goals. Yet, amidst these challenges, SIDS possess vast human, cultural, and natural resources, particularly in the realm of oceanic wealth. With control over approximately 20% of the world's oceans and seas through the exclusive economic zones, SIDS are rightfully recognized as large ocean states entrusted with the stewardship of sustainable marine ecosystem. This unique position is not only integral to the cultural identity and prosperity of SIDS, but also presents opportunities for global economic growth and environmental preservation. As we engage in this forum, we have a great opportunity to make a difference. Let us harness our collective wisdom, creativity, and innovation to foster dialogue, exchange ideas, and to co-create solutions to foster a new decade of development for small island developing states. I take great pride in our office's role in contributing to the organization and conceptualization of this conference, but I see it just as the beginning. I envision a future marked by frequent and sustained dialogue such as this one over the next decade. This week, our Under-Secretary General, alongside with LDCs and development partners, are convening in Helsinki for the second LDC Future Forum. Building on the success of the inaugural Future Forum preceding the LDC 5 conference, it was decided that the Future Forum be held annually, at least during the initial stages of the LDC 5 implementation. I hope to see a similar commitment to continuity for the SIDS Future Forum. My entire team and I remain fully committed to provide necessary support to SIDS in every step of their journey towards more resilience, prosperous, and sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to hear from the SIDS Envoy and Deputy Director for the Americas and Head of the Caribbean and SIDS for the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Rebecca Fabrizi. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Morning and afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here today in New York and talking about this really important topic. And it's also a great pleasure to work with Rezi and Emily with all the fantastic work that they're doing and with the other organisations on looking at solutions for SIDS. And I'd really like to commend the very important work that's been done, as others have mentioned, in building this evidence base on some of the key issues for SIDS that we can really use, because I think that we all know that SIDS don't fall neatly, as the very small SIDS don't fall neatly into the models of development that we use. And there's always a risk that they're left out of discussions and that SIDS needs are not met in those. So I should say that as the UK, that we are really proud to be a champion for SIDS. So, and we are really looking hard at SIDS 4 and how to make the conference a success, as I think that everybody else is as well. This includes providing support to events like this and to SIDS 4 itself. I've even sent a couple of lucky colleagues to Antigua for 6 months to help with the running and so on and planning for the conference too, because it's obviously difficult. Again, you know, we talk about SIDS having lower capacity, and I think it's, you know, fantastic that our colleagues from Antigua and Barbuda are doing this amazing job in setting up such a big conference, which I think is unprecedented for them, and I'm sure it's going to be a great success. I'd like to say to everybody here who's working on this and who's been working on negotiations that we really do see SIDS 4 as being a really important moment. You know, it's a conference that happens every 10 years, and that means that it's quite a long time until the next one, and it's a moment that there's going to be real attention on dealing with some of the unique issues that SIDS face. There'll be attention from the international community and from the donor community, and so it's a really great opportunity that is important not to miss. So please do make sure that you're engaging hard with your capitals about making sure that they are invested and working to make sure that SIDS 4 is a success. I think, you know, we've had some interesting comments already, and I agree that it's very important that we create a sense of momentum, that we're ambitious in looking at what we can achieve for SIDS, but also, you know, that we look at ambitious but plausible objectives that we can measure, and that we really make sure that we take advantage of all of that momentum. So from the UK side, we are really focusing on policy advocacy for SIDS and working with the SIDS, working with Antigua and with the AOSIS and with the rest of the SIDS group to really listen and to have a good dialogue and to listen to what the SIDS are looking for in terms of solutions, and then to make sure that we can use our voice as a donor to promote those solutions. This includes through avenues such as the DAC SIDS task force that we've been working on quite intensively and so on, and other policy initiatives. And we're looking at, there are certain areas where we see there's a great opportunity for improvements. Recognizing vulnerability in a clearer and more transparent way is one of them. Dealing with the bureaucracies that SIDS face, with not having very high capacity to manage the bureaucracy to access the funding that they need. So working both to reduce that and to support SIDS governments to manage it as well. And improving the impact of development programming and the other work that we're doing on the ground in SIDS, where its impact could definitely be improved. And I think we did an important job in producing the principles for effective development impact that were launched about a year ago. So without further ado, I think we're going to have some really great discussions today. And so I really really hope that everybody will engage very strongly and that we can all work together to make sure that SIDS 4 is a big success. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks to the UK government for supporting this event. We're going to move into a segment now to look back at the lessons from the previous SIDS decades and agendas from Barbados, Mauritius, and Samoa. So I'm going to turn first to the AOSIS chair and permanent representative of Samoa to the UN, Ambassador Luteru, to provide some reflections on where we have come from and lessons from the previous decades. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Emily, for the invitation. Excellencies and friends of SIDS. I'm not sure that I'll be able to give you a comprehensive sort of look back in terms of the history of SIDS, but I will try to give you something that we can, at least during this conversation, try to focus on. In 1992, the Rio Summit successfully acknowledged small island development states and low-lying development states as a special case for their environment and development, and the necessity of a dedicated international conference for this group of countries. Then in 1994, the first international conference on SIDS adopted the Barbados Program of Action. Grounded in Agenda 21, the Program of Action emphasized the SIDS sustainable development priorities. These were largely environmental in nature, with an underpinning of the means of implementation for these priorities. 10 years later, the Mauritius strategy was defined to address the remaining gaps of the Barbados Plan of Action. It was not until the Samoa pathway that SIDS addressed the cross-section of development issues. The 5 priority areas of the Samoa pathway look at the 3 action areas of sustainable development, as well as the role of partnerships to achieve its goal. In 30 years since 1994, SIDS have achieved some success, but its greatest development challenge, climate change, remain ever present. In a few short months, we will return to the Caribbean with a collection of lessons and an opportunity for enhanced focus. As we approach the finalization of the SIDS 4 outcome document and reflecting on our collection of lessons, I wish to emphasize only 2 of them. First, we will not engage in a sectorial listing of challenges to be met, as we did with the Samoa pathway. It was imperative, given the struggle for resources and attention, that the focus be streamlined and action-oriented. The 3 main chapters in the draft outcome document are in direct response to that acknowledgement. They look at where SIDS sit in the global community, reflect on the future SIDS chose for themselves, and select a few key optimal areas that can transform their societies and economies to meet current and future demands. We believe that the integration of these issues will facilitate a more structured approach to SIDS development, both by SIDS themselves and secondly, by the international community. Second, the monitoring of the successes and limitation of the Samoa pathway came too late. SIDS have emphasized that this will not happen again. Without a credible and scientific look at how to map, measure, and meet the priorities we lay out, then future action becomes unsustainable. We intend to ground this outcome in a detailed program of action that delineates measurable, verifiable, and reportable outcomes. The advanced unedited copy of this year's Financing for Sustainable Development report reiterate what SIDS knows well. While we have rebounded from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, great gaps remain. Our liquidity buffers are diminished. Many of us face high debt levels, and the effect of climate change and disasters continue to threaten our development. We sit on the edge, concerned that the next crisis or event will be unforgiving, and we will again have lost ground. Resilience needs to take root. AOSIS welcomes this engagement and views it as both important and timely. Development is a collective endeavor, and we are hopeful that the proposal we will hear today will move us that much closer to the resilient prosperity SIDS seek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We'll now hear from my colleagues, RESI co-director, Dr. Matt Bishop, who is also a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield, who's going to provide some further reflections with Dr. Courtney Lindsay from ODI on lessons from the previous SIDS decades and how we can take those forward. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. And just like Dr. Luther, I want just not to be comprehensive, but just to provide a bit of context and and to say why it's important that we are here today. Because if we look across, if we examine the SIDS agenda across all the previous conferences so far since 1994, one of the things that is glaringly obvious is that the same developmental challenges keep presenting themselves over and over again. With one exception is that they're taking on greater urgency and becoming increasingly more difficult to address. So, for example, in the Barbados Plan of Action, we had 14 areas of policy concerns. And by the time we got to the Samoa Pathway, which was the most ambitious of the three conferences, we had 24 clauses within that document. So coming down now to the SIDS 4 zero draft document, we're seeing the same issues and, like I said, taking on greater urgency. So the need for capacity development, debt becoming an increasingly difficult issue, intractable to address, the climate crisis and the need for disaster preparedness, data collection, again coming up since 1994, clean technology, etc. But we also see new issues coming up: human trafficking, non-communicable diseases, crime and violence taking over many of our islands and creating difficult situations in terms of getting economic growth going. So hopefully we can use this opportunity to for the next 10 years to make true tangible progress toward resilient and sustainable development in SIDS. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everybody. Good morning. So our job really is to set the scene and think about the context in which this agenda took place previously and continues to take place. And building on what Courtney just talked about, I think it's worth remembering that SIDS 3, like SIDS 2 and SIDS 1 before it, took place in a very particular global context. This was a context defined by the immediate aftermath, really, of the global financial crisis that many SIDS were still reeling from, and arguably in some respects perhaps still are today. It was also the high point of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, which brought with it a kind of global faith in benchmarking and indicators and all of the things that we heard Ambassador Ambassador Luteru talk about. And then it was kind of bookended by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think if we think about just how inauspicious this context was, it's remarkable that the Samoa Pathway was as successful as it was actually in that period of great global turbulence. Looking forward a little bit, and I'm going to kind of I'm going to kind of set the scene for Tomasi and Margot, who'll be speaking in a moment. I think it's important to remember that SIDS 4 will also take place and will emerge in a particular global context of its own. And my colleague Jack Corbett's going to talk about this a bit more at the end of the day in terms of the kind of global political shifts that we're seeing. But there are a whole set of processes that are very, very immediately on the horizon. So we've got a major CHOGM taking place later this year in Samoa, the first time it's been held in a small island developing state for almost a decade. We've got the UN financing for development process, which happens next year. We've got the Oceans Conference next year as well. It will also be 10 years on from the Paris Agreement next year. And it will be 5 years before the end of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So this is a really, really big set of global processes into which the SIDS 4 conference and then the Antigua-Barbuda Accord for SIDS has to sit. So I guess my kind of key takeaway point here really is that the more expansively we can think about where SIDS 4 fits into those bigger, broader global agendas, the even more productive, I'm sure, our conversations will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt and Courtney. So now the final sort of segment of the opening session, we're going to look forwards at what SIDS want from the SIDS 4 agenda. And who better to hear from than the OASIS lead negotiator on sustainable development, Margot St. John Sebastian, who's going to tell us a bit about what's been discussed so far, maybe what's in the outcome document, some of the sort of priorities and ambitions. Thanks, Margot.
Thank you very much, Emily. Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, friends of SIDS, according to my ambassador. So it's good for me to just set a little bit of the background on the document. This document is being prepared for the 4th SIDS conference, which is going to be held in Antigua and Barbuda from the 27th to the 30th of May this year. And what set the tone for the document is the regionals and the interregionals. So the regionals were held in Mauritius for the ACE region, St. Vincent and the Grenadines for the Caribbean region, and Tonga for the Pacific region. In Cape Verde, we brought all those 3 regions together to come out with a very focused and a very targeted SIDS way forward for this document. So the document layout itself is on 5 main sections. The first section is the SIDS story. So this section lays out the special case for sustainable development for SIDS and gives a little background in the 32 years since Rio, how far we have gotten. Section 2 is what do SIDS want? Here, this area covers the SIDS, what SIDS have identified in their regional and interregional meetings as key development drivers. So this program of action is one that is not going to list all the challenges of SIDS, but it is framed in a way in which there is a trickle-down effect from the big key areas into all the development challenges of SIDS. So that was the intent of this document. The document also tried to put forth the true story of the interactions of these challenges for SIDS, and not necessarily just list all the challenges, but show the interaction, that the real time on the ground for SIDS, how it happens. And in doing so, though, it becomes a little conflicting with how generally these challenges are faced throughout the world, the rest of the world. So it is becoming really challenging to sort of have this program of action speak specifically to the interaction that SIDS are facing real time. So section 2 tries to lay out that dynamic here. Section 3 is on how do we get there? Do I need to tell you? Access to finance, scaling up climate finance, strengthening data collection, science, technology, innovation, and digitalization, productive populations, and partnerships. Also emerging is a discussion around what is biodiversity financing. This is also a critical aspect for SIDS. On the 4th section is about a more effective UN in support of SIDS, because the UN plays a critical role in SIDS development. So this section covers that area, including, things like a mechanism for the ACE region, because they are the only sub-region that doesn't have a sort of coordinating mechanism. So there is a pathway, hopefully, that we hope will happen so that SIDS of the ACE region, who are spread very far across the ACE region, would be able to coordinate better, just as the Caribbean and the Pacific region. On the last area is monitoring and evaluation, which I hope the discussions here and the discussions moving forward will target this, because what the document does not do is lay out targets and indicators. We thought at first we should paint the picture of the dynamics for SIDS before we start, and have an understanding of that before we start laying out what would be targets and indicators for us to develop. So this would be a key element that I hope this fora and a lot of forums that we will be having on the way forward would address, which is our monitoring and evaluation. And in saying that, I also think we need to start looking at the midterm review, start planning ahead of time. We need to keep these things in mind and in sight. On the negotiation of the document itself, as you would know, it is very difficult at times. I think for us, we are getting the point across. This is a POA for SIDS. Let us keep the focus on SIDS. It's very hard, but let us keep the focus on SIDS and not generalize everything and not bring everything from all the frameworks that SIDS are unable at this point to cover because of the dynamics within SIDS. So bringing back those frameworks would not help us. So within the negotiations, I think we are getting this point across. Let us focus on SIDS. Let's focus on the dynamics that SIDS face from day to day regarding all these elements that, yes, the rest of the world also experience, but in a different way from how SIDS experience it. So I think I'm going to stop here. It is a long road still. We have a resume session tomorrow to try to complete the second round of consultations on the document. And the third round of consultations will be held from the 19th to the 21st of March. So it is not far away, but we have a lot of work still to do. And AOSIS is actually negotiating through the G77 and China. We have formed a good partnership through the G77 and China, and we look forward to moving forward this way. And I do see some of the negotiators are here, sorry, from the developed countries, and we are happy that you are here to hear some more about the dynamics within SIDS. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. And you can tell from what's been presented that there's really a lot of hard work going into the negotiations and still a lot more to do. But we really appreciate the hard work of AOSIS. I'm going to turn now to Deputy Permanent Representative for Antigua and Barbuda, Tomasi Blair, who's going to tell us a bit about what the vision is for the SIDS4 conference and beyond, as we look ahead to the rest of today and the discussions in the following sessions. Thank you, Tomasi.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning to everyone. Not sure why everyone is looking so sad. The weather was great yesterday, so I hope you all had fun. I think I'll start by indicating that I'm extremely happy to see some of our development partners here with us this morning, because the presentation that I'm going to give, at least the vision of Antigua and Barbuda, is one that I think you guys would want to hear in how you can help us implement this new 10-year framework. And I think Margot articulated the contents of the draft outcome document very well. How do we look forward to the next 10 years, and what do we expect to achieve within the 10-year framework? I think I'll probably start by indicating at least my personal regrets that at least this SIDS Future Forum did not take place before the regionals and the interregional, because I do believe that as SIDS, we deserve more opportunities by different stakeholders to advocate for some of our issues, but also to bring new ideas to the forefront. I will, however, say, and I would give a special commendation to Simona, who started a non-stakeholders consultation on how do we add additional elements to the draft outcome document and the vision for SIDS going forward. Antigua and Barbuda's vision for the next 10-year framework is extremely bold, I will say. And perhaps it didn't fit into the UN context or the traditional means of how the UN would conduct conferences, number one, but also how the UN would articulate frameworks all together. And so I think when we started our consultation with various partners, there was a gravitation to the ideas that Antigua and Barbuda are putting forward in trying to move from the traditional way that the UN would normally look at small states. And so for the last 30 years, I will say that the UN system has failed SIDS, and also perhaps the international community has failed SIDS. But I think this is an opportunity for a reset and a rethinking of minds. And so SIDS have experienced a 300% increase in the intensity of high impact disasters in 2020s, with a significant spike of 196% in the 2020s. And this is compared to previous decades. SIDS constitute 2/3 of countries experiencing the highest relative annual losses from such events, with disasters related damages as a percentage of GDP surging to nearly 90% over the same period. Between 2011 and 2022, the affected population of SIDS increased by around 120%, and death per million rose by about 60%. So I gave this stat to set the framework in the direction that Antigua and Barbuda intends to take in the implementation of this new 10-year framework. And based on the stats, you would see that SIDS are literally in trouble. And we have consistently said that this decade perhaps may be the last opportunity for the international community to really try and save SIDS. And so this plan or this new framework will only work if we are bold enough to quantify this new 10-year framework. Let us start by talking dollars, what it means to get SIDS to chart the course towards resilient prosperity, and how much would it cost. And so Antigua and Barbuda's vision for the 10-year framework, in the implementation of the 10-year framework, perhaps is seen as a Marshall Plan for SIDS, one that would mobilize significant international resources to implement this framework. The first pillar of the Marshall Plan for SIDS would be to address climate change and environmental sustainability. This would prioritize investments in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and climate resilient infrastructure. Here, we are talking about funding renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydropower, reducing reliance on imported fossil fuels and promoting sustainability, and also funding to build seawalls, preserving coastal ecosystems, and implementing early warning systems. By doing so, not only would you be reducing our vulnerability to climate change, but also foster economic growth and development. And these areas we have articulated in the in the draft outcome document under section 2. Secondly, our vision for the Marshall Plan would focus on building economic resilience and diversification, and we have captured some of these elements also in the draft outcome document. These are also listed under section 2 and section 3. So the international community must support SIDS in developing new industries under this concept of a Marshall Plan. And perhaps if you're not familiar with the Marshall Plan was the reconstruction of Europe. And because of that reconstruction of Europe, Europe is seen as an economic powerhouse presently, and they're able to withstand various shocks. And so our vision for this Marshall Plan is to ensure that SIDS are able to achieve economic resilience, but also to weather the storms when these shocks occurs. And so when we look at agriculture and fisheries development, supporting SIDS would mean supporting small-scale agriculture and fisheries that would improve food security and create economic opportunities for local communities. This could involve investments in infrastructure training and market access for small-scale farmers and fisher folks. We know our challenges in accessing affordable and appropriate financing for development. So this Marshall Plan would support the establishment of a dedicated financing mechanism, such as credit facilities and loan guarantees. This would facilitate investment in key sectors, and it must be complemented by a total debt cancellation for SIDS. The feature of debt is paramount for SIDS, and debt sustainability also would mean that SIDS would be able to no longer depend on so much on the international community for support. Currently, as we're gathered here, there is a strategic advisory group that is meeting, co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and the President of Maldives. And this is to discuss the launch of the SIDS Debt Sustainability Support Initiative. This will be launched at SIDS 4. And so we see this SIDS Debt Sustainability Support Initiative as a new mechanism that would allow for SIDS not only to gain the capacity in looking at their debt portfolios, but also to achieve debt sustainability in the long run. And this initiative will be launched at SIDS 4. Additionally, this notion of a Marshall Plan for SIDS should prioritize investments in education, healthcare, and social welfare. COVID-19 has showed us all too well the shocks that SIDS endure based on global occurrences. And so by investing in these areas, SIDS can build a healthy and educated workforce, fostering long-term economic growth and development. Again, to be specific, we're talking about investing in education and skills development that will help to build qualified workforce and foster entrepreneurship and innovation. This could involve something as simple as packaged set of scholarships for higher education, vocational training programs, and support for research and development. These are designed just for SIDS and should be held in trust just for SIDS. The innovation and technology mechanism that will be in the Center of Excellence for SIDS, along with the relaunch of the SIDS Consortium of Universities, can help build on these ideas of scholarships and innovation. Furthermore, a Marshall Plan for SIDS should include support for good governance as we face challenges related to weak institutions. By investing in good governance and strengthening our institutions, We will have an environment conducive to sustainable development and inclusive growth. This would also attract more foreign investment and partnerships, further contributing to our economic development. Perhaps this new 10-year framework is the backdrop for this Marshall Plan that I'm articulating. And one way to achieve this is to start again by adding dollars to this new 10-year framework. What would it cost? And we know it would cost far less than supporting the current global unrest. We know it will cost far less than the combined total amount being spent on space exploration, and far less than the push for global automation. The reality is, if we fail to capture this moment, we will never be able to regain this, as it might be far too more costly to do so for our islands, or our islands would have disappeared. My delivery here is not to say that the new 10-year framework is weak, but it's to show that we can turn this new 10-year framework into action in order to deliver on the concept of a Marshall Plan for SIDS that will cover the next 10 years. I hope that after 2034, we're not here again regarding a new 10-year framework for SIDS, but rather showcasing how the previous 10-year framework worked for SIDS and showcasing its best practices. I will end by saying to our partners at the table, we truly do need your support. And you should not be looking at this 10-year framework and the prospect of a Marshall Plan as handout for SIDS. It's literally strengthening our capacity. It is ensuring that we can also support ourselves when shocks arrive. And so my plea to you is to look at this 10-year framework through the negotiations from the lens of a Marshall Plan, and hopefully within the next 10 years, SIDS will be able to achieve sustainable development.
Thank you very much, Tomasi, and really set out there some very exciting ideas about what a Marshall Plan for SIDS might look like, and this 10-year framework. And I really encourage everyone to think throughout the day what you might want to add to that and what sort of additional elements need to go in there, because this is a great opportunity for a sort of brainstorm to come up with more ideas as to how we can collectively deliver for SIDS over the next 10 years. So we're going to have a coffee break now until 10:25. Thank you very much to all the speakers this morning for being very concise. We're on time, slightly ahead of time, I think even, which is amazing. Please have some coffee, refreshments. The restrooms are down. I think there's one over there by the elevator, and the rest of them are downstairs in the basement. Get up, move around, and we will reconvene at 10:25 for the first session on resilient economies. Thank you. Okay, can we get started again? We're going to move into session 1 on resilient economies. If everyone could take their seats, please. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had chance for a coffee, something to eat, catch up with friends. I'm going to hand over to the chair for the next session, Courtney, in a sec, who will introduce the session and the presenters on resilient economies. I just want to remind everybody that once you've heard from the presenters and the respondent, there'll be a roundtable discussion. So please all feel free to come in with questions and comments. You can use your name tag to signal that you would like to say something. Please do introduce yourself and where you come from when you come in, because I don't know about anybody else's eyesight, but I can't read any of the name tags. So yeah, just let everyone know who you are. So let me hand over to Courtney to introduce the presenters, and we'll have short presentations on the papers, which I hope you will enjoy. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So we go into the first panel session for today on resilient economies. How can SIDS improve the investment climate, diversify sustainably into new sectors, increase productive capacity, and augment their fiscal space? So we have 3 very impressive panelists with very good papers to present to us this morning. Each of them have 5 minutes to present. We'll allow them all to present, and then we'll have a respondent, after which we'll have questions and comments from you, the audience. And as Emily said, we'll introduce ourselves before we make our questions, our comments. So our first panelist this morning to present is Priya Mohan. Priya is a senior fellow. Dr. Mohan is a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies at UE, the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. And she works on climate policy, energy policy, food policy, regional development issues, among other areas, having written copiously on each of these. So Priya, the podium is yours.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Courtney. So good morning, good afternoon. Thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to present today, and of course, accepting this paper to be part of this project. So my paper looks at the diversification challenge for SIDS, and it presents a framework for selecting climate resilient sectors for SIDS to diversify towards by looking at best practice case studies across the globe, across SIDS. So let's begin by asking, why should we be concerned about diversification? Well, as we know, SIDS are vulnerable to climate change, but not just because of their geographic location and their high exposure to climate impacts, but also because of their low levels of economic diversification and low levels of technological development. Now, economic volatility from climate shocks negatively affects economic growth in SIDS, and SIDS governments have long recognized this, and they target diversification to reduce risk from such shocks, but with little success today. In fact, economic activity continues to be concentrated in sectors that are susceptible to climate impacts, such as tourism, agriculture, and the extraction of natural resources. Now, with the coming of the Paris Agreement, there has been an emphasis for structural transformation, which involves diversification into climate resilient sectors. And since the signing of the agreement, there has been an increase in investments and a shift in economic activity towards climate resilient industries and products, and a ramping up of climate finance to do so. Now, this presents an opportunity for SIDS to have a revitalized GOA diversification, but this time with special emphasis on climate-related sectors. And so this paper presents this framework for selecting these climate resilient sectors. So how do we come up with this framework and the selection of these sectors? Well, the framework begins by recognizing the unique challenges faced by SIDS, which act as barriers to diversification, as well as increasing their exposure to climate risk. And these barriers, as we know well, would be their limited land size and domestic resources, their economic and environmental vulnerability, their exposure to extreme weather events, and their dependence on external finance. Now, the selection of sectors to diversify towards must empower SIDS to overcome these barriers, but the selected sectors must also have high mitigation and adaptation potential. The sectors must be able to attract international support, whether through technical assistance or finance. The sectors must be able to increase innovation skills and knowledge of the local workforce, as well as knowledge sharing, community engagement, the building of social capital. And of course, the sectors must align with national development plans, international development goals, such as the SDGs, and international frameworks like the Paris Agreement and international financing mechanisms. Now, the selected sectors in the paper include renewable energy and energy efficiency, clean transport, climate resilient infrastructure, ocean-based sectors or the blue economy, land and forestry, knowledge-based economies, and waste and circular economies. Now, some of the case studies looked at in the paper includes Barbados to become complete renewable energy by 2030, Cabo Verde, complete electric mobility fleet by 2050. We have the Bahamas introducing the first blue carbon market. We have in the Maldives where they're using AI to monitor coral restoration and conservation. We have plastic upscaling in Samoa. So these are just some of the case studies that the paper would have looked at. And given my 5 minutes, I just pulled together some key insights across all of the case studies looked at. And these would include that some of this would have been said this morning. No one-size-fits-all approach to diversification would work across all SIDS, given our own unique natural resources, talent and knowledge of our workforce, our own levels of exposure to climate change. Small size of projects and small domestic markets hinder finance and private sector investment. Large capital investments with high upfront costs are needed, especially if we are to diversify into climate resilient infrastructure, and also knowledge economies, which would require investment in digital infrastructure, technology, ICT. We require effective environmental frameworks and regulations in areas such as natural capital protection, resource utilization, land tenure rights, carbon rights, coastal zone, and waste management. We also require data on natural resources, particularly ocean resources and forestry resources, if we are to monetize these natural resources and attract investment. We also require capacity building and technology transfer, especially in areas such as large renewable energy systems, and we heard about that this morning, climate resilient infrastructure, in areas like marine science, climate science, the measuring and monitoring of natural resources, carbon accounting, and carbon project design and implementation. We also require public awareness on climate resilient products in order to build market demand. This is particularly important for circular type products where the consumer plays a big role. Another example would be, for instance, in electric vehicles, where Cabo Verde did engage in building this type of awareness of the benefits. And lastly, collaboration is key, whether it be public-private partnerships, partnerships with universities, think tanks, civil society, and citizen engagement. So just to share the recommendations on the last slide, a knowledge transfer hub would be important in order to achieve these goals, similar to the SIDS green-blue economy knowledge transfer hub being proposed, where we can share best practices, offer capacity building and training, promote collaboration, raise community awareness, etc. Also, a SIDS data hub is very important to, again, ensure data accessibility, standardization, providing tools and expertise, sharing our best practice case studies, etc. And of course, the financing solutions, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot of over the course of today, where we can look at innovative solutions like blended finance, debt for nature swaps, etc., establishing robust financial management systems for efficiently attracting funds and investments, and partner with universities to develop the concept notes to attract the finance to then implement the project. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Priya. Remember, we are sticking to 5 minutes. I'll allow a minute over, but the aim is to have a robust discussion after, so presenters will have an opportunity to really go further into their papers and particularly into their recommendations. So the next speaker we have is Gail Hurley. She's no stranger to any of us. She's a senior development finance expert who consults for the UN NGOs, think tanks, and RESI, of course, and is an expert in development finance and debt crisis. Gail, over to you.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and a very good morning, very good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to contribute to this important discussion. So my presentation today looks at how SIDS can augment their fiscal space with a particular focus on debt, which we've heard mentioned a lot this morning already, and looking at the extent to which SIDS are affected by high levels of public debt currently, the impact this is having on their attempts to build resilient, sustainable economies, and most importantly, of course, what can be done about it where debt vulnerabilities exist. Okay, so we have looked at 6 countries in depth. They are listed for you there: Antigua and Barbuda, Cabo Verde, Fiji, Jamaica, Solomon Islands, and Tonga, all countries with very different economic profiles, different debt profiles as well. And we've looked at their debt journeys to gain insights into what strategies they have taken to effectively manage debt, what has been working, what has not been working, and then use that evidence to inform recommendations for policymakers at SIDS4 on what collectively we can do better on debt going forward, and actually help SIDS to build those resilient, sustainable, climate-friendly, high-skill green economies of the future. Okay, so what did we find? So the picture is very mixed in terms of debt across SIDS, but it's clear that in many countries it has been a persistent and unresolved challenge for several decades. And of course, it also featured prominently on the agenda of the SIDS3 conference a decade ago. And as was highlighted this morning by Ambassador Lutero, recent shocks have only made the problem much worse. So the COVID-19 pandemic, climate-related shocks have, unsurprisingly, contributed to large and rapid increases in public debt across many SIDS. So we see that debt to GDP in SIDS was 55% of GDP in 2019. 2022, that had risen to 61%. And of course, looking forward, if we think that climate vulnerabilities are only going to increase. That vulnerability to shocks and high increases in debt is only going to increase as well. There's also been a shift towards more expensive forms of debt, non-concessional debt, across many SIDS recently, with non-concessional debt now making up on average 74% of debt in SIDS in 2022. And if we look at the data here on debt service as a percent of revenues, I think that many of you will find that data really, really striking. Debt service, of course, with rising levels of debt, come rising levels of debt service. And of course, it is absolutely clear from this data here that in many countries, high levels of debt service are without question crowding out much needed expenditures on the social sectors, on efforts to build high-skill economies, and on efforts to green their economies so that SIDS are able to build those high-skill economies of the future. And just by way of reference, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which started in the 90s, it targeted a debt service to revenue ratio of just 15%. Which the argument was that would leave those countries with enough revenues in order to fund pro-poor expenditures. So you can see from this here just how far many SIDS are from that ratio there. Okay, so that is at a very high level the current picture of the challenges. So what's being done and what's working well and less well. So a lot is happening in the field of debt management. I think it's fair to say that. And there's been a lot of positive changes recently and since the last SIDS 3 conference. So let's look at some of the successes. So from the case study countries, there's overwhelming evidence, I think most importantly, that debt is actually being used well. It's really, really important to emphasize that. So for example, in Cabo Verde, it's being used concessional debt to invest in improved transportation links, Antigua and Barbuda to respond to recovery in the face of disasters. So this whole profligacy argument just doesn't hold true. The evidence doesn't stack up there. Secondly, reductions in debt are possible. Jamaica has been on an extraordinary debt reduction journey over the last decade, halving its debt to GDP ratio between 2013 and 2023. Things like fiscal responsibility laws, policies on non-concessional borrowing, which have also been implemented in Cabo Verde, have been useful. Tax reform, countries very much recognizing that you can't reduce debt or manage debt well unless you are taking measures to strengthen your tax revenues in various ways. And we're also seeing some countries make use of innovative sources of finance like debt swaps in Cabo Verde. In Fiji, green bonds and blue bonds have been utilized well there to raise new capital quite cheaply. And then I think finally, it's also fair to say that the international community has to some extent stepped up to offer over recent years, a more tailored suite of financial instruments to SIDS, particularly those that respond to emergency situations. So, for example, things like hurricane clauses being introduced by the multilateral development banks, new contingent financing facilities as well, which have all been helpful. But in terms of limitations, I think first, and most importantly, the biggest problem is that we're seeing that a lot of debt is not actually being used to advance sustainable development or to progress development, but is being used to recover former development levels. So basically, debt is not being used to advance from A to B, but actually just to get back to A. We're seeing that because of this vulnerability, that recent reductions in debts are therefore very precarious. So those debt reductions that I was talking about in Jamaica, for example, very fragile. There are limitations to fiscal reform efforts. Despite the progress there, we know because of countries' narrow economic bases, And SIDS also report that some of the innovations in debt instruments that they've been using, like debt swaps, green bonds, blue bonds, are really quite hard work for low capacity economies. And then finally, some of those instruments that I was talking about that have been introduced going forward, they actually do create new debt liabilities. So they're not necessarily the panacea, despite their positive features. So if I'm allowed 1 minute more, please, Courtney, to go through the most important bits on recommendations. What can we see that will make a difference going forward? I think it won't come as a surprise to anybody that it's a long-standing call. SIDS want to see vulnerability being used as a criteria for determining access to concessional finance. Second, there's been a lot of rhetoric about debt swaps, innovations in finance, blah, blah, blah. We actually see that a lot of the rules in place, the architecture around these instruments actually prevent debt swaps from happening where they're most needed. So we actually need to flexibilize some of the rules around these kinds of instruments to make sure they happen where they're needed. Thirdly, we need to significantly broaden the use of hurricane clauses, not just the multilaterals, but we need official creditors, bilateral creditors to be using these types of tools as well. Go above and beyond hurricane clauses. So they simply defer debt service for a short period of time while interest continues to accrue. They don't reduce debt burdens overall. Actually, we need to see debt cancelled for once a major shock occurs, let's just cancel the debt for, say, 3 years or 5 years. And let's not just defer it. That would actually have a more meaningful impact on reducing debt. The international community should also support SIDS to lower borrowing costs. And then I was really pleased to hear Tumasi talk about a new debt sustainability initiative to be launched in Antigua and Barbuda. A potential role also for the SIDS Centre of Excellence could be to help SIDS to also build their debt capacities, for example, to negotiate the terms of new financing, to negotiate debt restructurings, offer them an impartial and closed space where they can learn from each other, where they can also build their capacities in a neutral way. And then finally, I think it's really important that these are all practical measures, but there's also a much wider conversation taking place about much needed reforms to the international debt architecture. And those conversations, by and large, are not taking place with SIDS in the room. And yet those decisions taken will impact them enormously. So we need to find ways to make sure that SIDS' voice and representation is there wherever these major decisions on the international debt architecture are taken. Thank you, Courtney. So sorry, and
No
happy to
problem.
answer any questions you might have. Bye.
We'll just take about 3 minutes out of lunch to recover that time. All right, so Dan is a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography at Sheffield University, and he works on citizenship, civil society, political adaptation, and other issues. But he's here already. Straight into it then, Dan.
I wouldn't start before you'd finish,
Yeah.
but that's great. No, thank you. I've got my time running. Great, no, thank you. So I have to use a clicker. There we go. This is a paper developed on a project informed by my own work. And my colleague Sarah Pegg, who will talk to you later on for the civil society paper, I think in the next session, and Owen Parker, a colleague in politics at Sheffield. And our interest here is really around sovereignty sales. You may be thinking, what are sovereignty sales? Why do they matter? Well, sovereignty sales, I'll explain in a moment. But to begin with, let's just recognize that this is against the backdrop where we all know this, there's a range of vulnerabilities affecting small and developing states. There's a need for economic diversification. When we're talking about sovereignty sales schemes, what I'm doing here is drawing together literature and ideas, concepts around not only the kind of selling of passports, the golden passports, if you like, or residency visas, but also down to the scale of the digital nomad visas. And these have been part of the broader landscape of preferential citizenship schemes for many, many years now. And they are presented as a win-win scenario. States offering them gain revenue from the sales of these bits of paperwork, and the purchasers of them gain certain rights to reside, citizenship, to travel, to work in different locations, and so on. But they've also kind of been on the receiving end of a lot of opprobrium, a lot of critique, certainly from governments in the global north, around money laundering or concerns around money laundering, reputational laundering, and so on. One of the key concerns, I suppose, here is thinking more critically and supportively and constructively around how this somewhat nebulous field of engagement can be used as a very productive form of development finance to support sustainable development. Now, you might be thinking, surely this isn't a great big issue in the broader scheme of things. Well, actually, we're talking about an industry that's predicted to be worth by 2025, by next year, over £100 billion a year. We're talking about a lot of revenue flowing through here. We're talking about countries, in some situations, in some circumstances, where the revenue generated by these schemes is in excess of 30% of their GDP. I know when Matt saw the draft of this paper, he wrote coming back saying, wow, these schemes are big business, and they are big business on a range of scales. And for some countries, they are highly dependent upon these schemes, and there are real challenges when the viability of those schemes is questioned, when things like the Schengen visa travel is revoked and so on. There's broader situations here, I suppose the broader kind of findings that underpin this are drawn from a very kind of systematic review of existing research done around citizenship by investment schemes, residency by investment schemes, and other sovereignty sales across not only small island states, but beyond that, and the kind of shifting market in that field. It's a market that's been existing from about the 1970s onwards, and a real spike in the offering of schemes post the financial crisis of the early 2000s. And we're seeing, on the back of this, a diversification not only in the number of countries offering these schemes, but a diversification in the type of schemes being offered. And for those countries involved in this industry, there are real challenges and tensions emerging in terms of how to ensure these schemes are sustainable, how they can maintain that kind of legitimacy on the global scale, how they're seen as being trustworthy by many states, and how they can also ensure that the revenues generated by them are effective, efficient, and used productively to secure sustainable development on a range of scales. We're seeing the kind of key challenges emerging around this on a domestic level in some countries where growing political dissent, community dissent towards the growth of these schemes is coming to the fore. We've seen in certain countries a real kind of rise of tensions around this. In some situations, in some circumstances, kind of real political disagreements around those schemes. More broadly, other concerns arising in terms of the kind of lack of transparency around some of the economic benefits of how much money is coming in through these schemes, where that money is being used, and how it's being deployed more locally. On the flip side, and I want to ensure this has kind of got a positive spin to it as well, these schemes have effectively been used in many countries to promote employment diversification, to promote sustainable development, and we're seeing an increase from the survey of schemes that we have done in the growing use of these schemes to designate kind of earmarked funding from them for social development schemes and for kind of green energy transitions, for blue transitions and so on. So linking to many of the things that people talked about earlier on today, and how we're seeing those kind of schemes being used very effectively for those purposes and those outputs. With 30 seconds to go, so I'm going to rush through this, and I have my own time here. I'm hoping we're on the same time here, Courtney. A set of recommendations that are kind of quite lengthy, but I think kind of indicate the kind of complexities and interconnections of many of the challenges we're going to wrestle with through the rest of today. And the first, I suppose, one of the underlying concerns in many of these schemes is around transparency and governance. On an international scale, the critiques from countries selling the global north around the lack of transparency in schemes and how they operate and who can benefit from the schemes. We're already seeing a lot of measures taken to address those concerns. Recent agreements between the US and certain Caribbean nations are the fore of that, and we're seeing a lot of that kind of progress in that sphere. But there's more, perhaps a broader set of things here around how we can ensure greater transparency around the use of the finances from these schemes, how they can be specifically earmarked, budgeted for sustainable development projects through debt reduction, through resilient infrastructure projects, through certain forms of kind of community-based projects and so on. One of the key aspects here, I suppose, is if we look at many of the countries, some countries have excellent reporting standards where there's annual or biannual reporting of data that's very clearly demarcating where the money is going. In other countries, there's not. And I'll draw an example actually from a non-SIDS country here from Malta. And they put a lot of their money into a transformation fund, but trying to get the information about what that fund is used for is nigh on impossible. You can find details of one project with the Malta FA, and that is it. There's a real kind of issue there in terms of then generating and maintaining domestic support and international support for these schemes on that scale. Second area to think about here is then how to ensure these schemes deliver optimal impacts. There are examples of excellent practice out there. We're seeing how countries are using these schemes to support national development, to support transformation funds, to support higher education bursaries, and so on. I suppose one of the key challenges here is perhaps there's not yet been a full survey of that and understanding what those kind of key recommendations could be around what are the optimal outcomes of that and how we can take that forwards. There's a sentence here of kind of ensuring we can benchmark that best practice and build upon it. That leads into the final set of recommendations around future-proofing of the schemes. Undoubtedly, the need to diversify economies means these schemes are going to be vital going forwards. But how do you future-proof that? And how, for SIDS in particular, do they cope with the challenges faced by a growing number of markets, growing number of providers in the market sphere, but also recognizing, and crucially here, I think, understanding there is a growing diversity of people wanting to kind of purchase these schemes, to buy into these schemes with differing priorities and differing needs. And there's a scope here to think more creatively and more productively around different kinds of schemes and how they might be able to beneficially kind of support and explore that form of economic development. I'll stop there because I've already run 2 minutes over. I apologize.
Don't worry about it. Right. Thank you very much, Dan. And so our next presenter will be a response from Ambassador Odo Tevi of Vanuatu. Ambassador.
Thank you, Courtney. I thank the presenters for their excellent presentation and invaluable insights on the PCIDS, on the SIDS economies. The presenters have clearly stated that SIDS economies are not homogeneous. However, they do share similar characteristics such as their smallness due to small populations. Economies are concentrated only in few commodities such as tourism and agriculture, and highly dependent on favorable external conditions for economic growth. Furthermore, the SIDS economic sectors are highly vulnerable to adverse climate shocks. Given these underlying factors, policy options to increase economic growth and to expand the domestic revenue base are limited. Given that the SIDS economies are heterogeneous, there is no policy response that will best fit the economies. In spite of this, innovation and working together to share best practices will be crucial going forward. The paper by Dan on sovereignty cells have outlined that sovereignty cells have become a crucial part of revenues of some SIDS, as represented by increasing share of revenues to GDP over time. However, this revenue source faces some challenges internally and externally. These external concerns stems mainly on security, identity, and money laundering and tax evasion issues. As a result, some developed countries and major economic blocs, such as the EU, have revised their visa waiver status. These have diminished the attractiveness of these sovereign vehicles. The reputational risk of these SIDS economies and the sustainability of sovereignty cells remains a going concern. The presenters have highlighted that sovereign cells are marketed exclusively on few investment vehicles, such as the real estate, and SIDS should broaden the scope to other areas, such as the financing of disaster recovery and developing resilient infrastructure. Reducing long-term dependence on sovereign cells will be crucial, and perhaps consideration should be made on proceeds from sovereign cells should be made to establish sovereign wealth funds, and the proceeds can be used to finance its national sustainable development needs. Enhancing transparency and reputation by increasing dialogue between SIDS economies and developed countries will be crucial. Furthermore, strengthening data collection will be crucial, and capacity to measure progress will be critical. They have recommended that the establishment of the SIDS Center of Excellence and Data Hub to share best practices will be crucial in the future. The presentation by Haley pointed out that clearly some SIDS face challenges with their high
debt to GDP ratio, and as a result have limited fiscal space to invest in capital and social projects that could enhance SIDS' economic competitiveness and growth. The study points out that SIDS have invested their debts well, mainly in capital projects to boost their economic competitiveness. Given the climatic weather shocks that SIDS economies are continuously exposed to, they are locked in a cycle of recovery, then disaster. Over time, these disasters have increased their debt burden. The presenters have clearly highlighted that there's some progress made at the international levels to address SIDS debt levels, such as the offering of debt relief, introduction of natural disaster clauses, the implementation of innovative debt instruments, such as debt for nature swaps. However, they have pointed out that there is more work needed at the international level to find new solutions to debt sustainability in SIDS. Some of the areas to explore are, instead of pausing on principal and interest payments after facing natural disaster, what is needed is debt cancellation for some years. There's a lack of flexibility by creditor countries around debt swaps, and this has hindered its scaling up. A consideration of a SIDS Center of Excellence that serves as a platform to share knowledge and build capacity. Wider reforms in the international debt architecture and SIDS voice needs to be amplified given the special circumstances. The presentation by Mohan highlighted that SIDS are highly vulnerable to climate shocks, and thus it is critical that they diversify into climate resilient sectors such as renewable energy, climate resilient infrastructures, blue economy and ocean-based economies, knowledge-based economies, and circular economies. To scale investment in climate resilient sectors, they would need substantial climate and development finance. To date, most of the partnerships to develop these sectors are between SIDS and developed economies. Partnerships should be enhanced, and a consideration should be made on establishing a SIDS Green Blue Economy Knowledge Hub. This hub will be critical to scaling up climate resilient economies by sharing knowledge and best practices, enhance capacity building, training, and promote collaboration amongst government and private sector and civil society. The recommendations set out by all the papers are excellent. The question then is, how do we implement these recommendations, or whether they are feasible? In terms of the sovereign sales, while they increase the revenues of SIDS economies, they do pose reputational risk. I agree that the scope of these investment vehicles should be broadened to investments in climate resilient sectors. Furthermore, there should be a further exploration on the over-dependence of sovereign sales should not distract the SIDS governments from making necessary structural reforms to boost their economic productivity and to expand the domestic revenue base of the economy. For instance, in my country, Vanuatu, the IMF recommended that the government should expand its domestic revenue base, but to date, little has been done. In terms of the discussion of the international debt architecture, enhancing the SIDS voice will be highly crucial. How do we do this? There are several ways to do this. Perhaps an exploration of whether SIDS should be part of the discussion at the G20 meetings. The African Union has recently been invited, and SIDS with the unique circumstances should be considered a special case. Consistent message by all SIDS at the annual World Bank and International Monetary Fund meetings will be crucial. The forum on small states could be an avenue to discuss these matters. SIDS for Antigua and Barbuda, co-chairs Antigua and Barbados are looking at SIDS debt sustainability, as explained by Tomasi this morning, ensuring that recommendations are featured in current discussions at the international fora. For instance, the current discussions at the UN Summit of the Future, especially on Chapter 5, that focuses on the reform of the international architecture, is a unique opportunity to highlight some of the recommendations. Current UN discussions on multidimensional vulnerability index and how will it be implemented by the international financial institutions will be crucial. Another question, should the SIDS have a voice at the Paris Club discussion? This is crucial. However, it is important to bear in mind that increasing debt obtained by SIDS in recent years is not sourced from the Paris Club members, and the discussions within the club may have a limited impact. In all the presentations, the presenters have recommended that the setting up of the SIDS Center of Excellence, or a hub that could serve as a platform to share knowledge or best practices and build capacity of SIDS economies, will be crucial. This is an important recommendation. In the current SIDS 4 document, a recommendation was made to set up a SIDS data center. This could be a useful platform to share best practices. However, it is important that duplications are not made, especially if regional mechanisms are in place. Rather, the SIDS data hub should enhance the current work of the regional architecture by fostering more collaboration. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now to the exciting part. We have about 30 minutes for discussion, questions and answers. And we've heard some very good presentations from Dan, the sovereignty sales, the pros and cons. We heard about debt, and it, just to highlight again that SIDS are not profligate, but being trapped in a disaster recovery, disaster against cycle, debt cancellation is critical. And Priya outlined for us the many challenges faced by SIDS, but also the many opportunities in terms of how to go about diversification. And she has pointed out what some SIDS are already doing. So over to you now, to ask your questions, make your comments, so we could go further into each one of the papers. So please state your name first, and your organization, and who in particular you're directing the question to. So don't all rush in at once.
I'm very happy to go first.
Microphone, please.
I don't normally need a microphone. I understand it's being recorded. My name's Robert Powell. I'm the Special Representative to the United Nations for the International Monetary Fund. And I thought it might be useful to say a few words in particular on debt. I mean, there's many other topics I could talk about, but this one I think is a good one to kick off with. And first of all, to say I thought that the presentation we've just seen on debt was excellent. I thought it was very nicely done, well balanced, and generally I agree with pretty much most of it. While at the fund we don't see a systemic debt crisis at the moment, it's absolutely the case that many countries are having their important investment spending squeezed by the current financial conditions and the higher interest rates and the high debt service, and that is clearly a problem. It's also true that the landscape has changed now from where we were, say, 20 years ago when we were all working on the HIPC initiative, at least those of us with grey hair were doing that. And it's much more difficult actually doing debt relief initiatives these days than it was back then when it was just the Paris Club. And that certainly complicates things. And that's one of the reasons why we have the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable that has been doing very good work on debt restructuring methodology over the last few months, bringing not just the Paris Club, but other creditors and debtors to the room to talk about these things. When they are discussed in Washington at the boards of the IMF and the World Bank, I should remind you that all SIDS do have representatives at the boards of the IMF and the World Bank. Yes, we work in constituency frameworks, but all countries do have representation in the executive boards and are part of those discussions. Yes, absolutely, more concessional finance, and as the Secretary General has been pushing, is very much part of the solution here, as is more domestic revenue mobilization. And that's certainly one of the messages that you'll be hearing from the International Monetary Fund as we go through the SIDS 4 and the other important conferences going forward. Vulnerability is extremely important. And that's one of the reasons, or recognizing the impact of vulnerability is very important. That's one of the reasons actually why the IMF has for many years now taken SIDS status, so just small state status, and vulnerability and high levels of debt into account when looking at the eligibility for concessional resources So that's something that we very much agree is important. And finally, on capacity development, certainly we recognize that strengthening institutions is a very important, and that's been mentioned again this morning, is a very important part of this process. And I know that at the IMF, 17% of our capacity building activity is in small states, which is obviously a much smaller share of population or GDP or quota or whatever you want to look at. So we very much give priority to trying to give capacity building to small states. And in that context, we have a number of technical assistance centers around the world. We've got one in the Caribbean and in Barbados. We've got one in Fiji. We've got a number of others. But these are actually for where a lot of peer-to-peer learning goes on and exchanging of ideas amongst the countries that are working in that area. So again, I think the idea of peer-to-peer learning and finding experiences from each other is very important as well. Sorry to go on so long.
Right,
Thank you.
no problem. Thank you very much, Robert, for that insightful comment. And don't know, Gail, if you have any brief responses to it or no? Yes, let's go around first. Okay, in the back there.
Let me thank you, Courtney, for coordinating our Q&A session. My question, Courtney, is with respect maybe to the last presenter before Ambassador Oda came up.
Your name, please, again?
My name is Ambassador Tone from PR of Tonga.
Okay.
Sorry. My question is with regards, I think there was Dan Hammett, if I remember correctly. Dan, you did touch on a very important point to me, and it's about the artificial intelligence. And my question to you, as we're looking into SIDS 4 and how to augment or accelerate our economic development, which is a key essence of these presentations. My question to the panel and maybe to the partners is how can we capitalize on the artificial intelligence? I think the last speaker mentioned, I think maybe part of the solution about capacity development, building. But I think I can also see maybe addressing digital divide. But I'm thinking of SIDS as a region which are sparsely distributed in our region, whether it's a Pacific or Caribbean or ACE, and we don't have the numeracy of population. Of course, when you capitalize on something, the economy of scale plays a very important part. We don't seem to have the economy of scale when we do exports or many things. But I can see the potential of artificial intelligence being a capacity that will connect us electronically as maybe a way of leapfrogging ourselves in terms of our physical limitation. So my question is to the panel, how can we capitalize on the digital age with artificial intelligence to augment our capacity, but also the digital divide to leapfrog in terms of our economic development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tomasi?
Thanks. Hello. Thanks. I think the presentations were extremely good. I really did enjoy the presentation by Gail and also by Dan. Perhaps maybe just to get a better idea from Dan in terms of the sovereignty sales that you've indicated of $100 billion by 2020. It will reach $100 billion by 2025. It'd be good to get an idea of what percentage of this constitutes SIDS. Because I think we are well aware that SIDS are not the only countries that offer what you term as sovereignty sales. I think this started in the developed countries. A lot of them sell the same passport and access to their countries, similar to that of SIDS. So it would be a good idea to get an idea of what percentage of that constitutes two SIDS. My second question stems from the remarks made by my good friend from the IMF, which I'm a bit surprised on. I think you indicated that the IMF don't see a debt crisis, but I'm wondering if this is in the context of a global debt crisis. And so we're talking about SIDS in particular, and I'm looking at a report coming out from UNCTAD, and I'm going to read the findings of the report. It says by 2019, external debt accounted for 62% of GDP on average in SIDS, compared to 29% of all developing countries. It also goes on to indicate that SIDS external indebtedness is considerably higher than that of other developing countries. Between 2000 and 2019, the external debt for SIDS rose by 24 percentage points, while in developing countries, debt fell by 6.2 points on aggregate. So given this analysis, do you not see that there's a debt crisis within SIDS? And then I turn this question over to Gail Hurley, whether or not, based on these findings, whether or not SIDS should continue to push for what we want, similar to the HIPIC initiative, and perhaps maybe guidance could be given to SIDS on how we can achieve debt cancellation.
Thank you very much, Tomasi. We'll take two more before we go to the panelists. So let's start with Simo over there. Okay, so there, and then we go to Simona. That is Caroline, is that you? Oh.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and good morning, Excellencies and colleagues, and thank you for inviting us to this very interesting event. My question is—
your name first, please.
Sorry, Claudia Leroux, Dominican Republic Permanent Mission. My question is directed to Dan Hammett, and it's for me, the issue of the sovereignty sales is very interesting. It has a very bad name, sovereignty sales. I think that optics matter, and I think we should call it something else, because really it doesn't sound very good, even though it has the potential of being something very good. Is there a connection or a link? Because the issue is new for me. Is there a connection or a link between sovereignty sales and direct foreign investment? Should there be? Any guidance or insights that you might offer would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Claudia and Janine, and then we go to Simona.
Hi, good morning, and thank you very much to the presenters. I'm Janine Felsen, I'm from Belize. I'm not representing my government's views, and I'm just reacting to the presentations that have been made. First of all, thank you. And I will have to reflect on your papers in depth, which I have not had an opportunity to do. But on the presentations themselves, I think what comes out, the messaging that comes out from these presentations is that SIDS need to do more. And I think what we heard from Tomasi's presentation is that SIDS have done a lot. SIDS have continued to do a lot in terms of building their resilience. And in fact, SIDS are resilient in their own ways. The issue is really on the other end, on the other side of the table. It's on the international response to small island developing states. So when you look at the debt-related issues, it's the response from the international community. It's not what SIDS need to do more of, it's what can the international community do to support SIDS. When you think about even the sovereignty sales, I mean, Belize had gone through a whole series of economic citizenship programs. And in fact, we were basically condemned for them. So there is a high political risk with what I know as BSIP. So those are issues. So everything turns to SIDS to do more when in fact we've been doing a lot to actually try to manage the series of shocks and crises that have either been generated outside or have landed at our doorstep because of factors that are beyond our control. So I think, you know, I appreciate all the research that has gone into it, but I think into these various issues, but I think we really need to start looking at where exactly the international community actually steps into to support SIDS. So I just wanted to share that. I do think that the questions about, debt that Tomasi just raised, I think that's really important because we do have this seeming questioning narrative about whether or not there is a debt crisis amongst small island developing states. And I think amongst small island developing states, there is continuing significant debt distress for many of our countries. I mean, Belize went from over 100% debt to GDP ratio and through a debt swap initiative was able to shave off double digits. But, that's over a period of time and where we had significant growth. Coming out of COVID, that's going to change. The debt landscape will change again. So I just want to make that point and look forward to comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janine. And now to Simona, and then we'll turn back.
Very briefly, thank you so much, Courtney. My name is Simona Vainescu. I'm Senior Advisor, Small Island Developing States. I just wanted to first commend all the presenters, great papers and great meeting, by the way. Thank you so much, ODI and RESI Initiative. And to add a few comments on that and also take advantage of the presence of our colleague from the IMF in the room to make a proposal. So SIDS are not in a debt crisis at the levels that other countries experience because they can't borrow anymore. The cost of that is very high. They have very low credit ratings or no credit ratings at all. And in some cases, they borrow at interest rates that are above the growth rates. So they accumulate that to GDP, even if they don't continue to borrow anymore, just because, again, the interest rates that they have access to in the debt market are above the growth rates that they are able to generate. I would like to, so it's the cost of that, and because they can't borrow anymore, they underspend. So critical sectors are being underfunded because they can't borrow anymore. I would like to ask our colleague from the International Monetary Fund if an initiative that was launched at COP28 for Bangladesh could be replicated regionally for small island developing states. So I'm reading from the IMF page. We've looked into that and we think this is a great way to take forward the conversation on access to affordable financing and financing for resilient prosperity in SIDS. So on 3rd of December, international financial institutions, bilateral donors, and private sector and sectors announced the collaborative approach with the government of Bangladesh to establish the Bangladesh Climate and Development Platform, a project preparation facility, and financial commitments for public and private investments for adaptation and mitigation in country following the Resilience and Sustainability Facility arrangement. So this is expected to leverage additional private sector investment in the future. I just want to say that having been listening to SIDS throughout the consultation process for the outcome document, such a platform would be of great value. If we could organize it regionally, with again the IMF being the host and the initiator of this platform with bilateral donors and private sector, possibly the UN as well, although in Bangladesh, the UN is not a member of this platform, would be of great support. A project formulation facility to help SIDS access opportunities and leverage private sector financing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simona. And so, Robert, you found yourself in the hot seat there and inadvertently ended up on the panel. So we're just going to let you go first briefly to respond to Tomasi and Simona.
Great. Let me just respond to the last point first. I don't know the details of the Bangladesh experience. Just to be clear, and often people mix the fund and the bank up. The IMF doesn't do any project lending as such. The World Bank does project lending, but I can certainly find out about what happened in that situation, and if it's a model that works, then I'm sure that could be looked at. But it may well be it's more for the multilateral development banks than for the fund. Just to be clear on what I'm saying about debt is, whether we call it a crisis, a debt crisis or not, it can, in a sense, we can, it becomes semantics at some point. The point I'm making is that while the risk of a systemic wave of sovereign defaults we think is low, I don't rule out the possibility that there could be more. But that doesn't take away from the fact that debt service burdens are clearly crowding out important investments. Now, the question is then, what do you want to do about that? Most countries try to avoid debt restructuring if they can, because there are costs of debt restructuring. It tends to take a long time, far too long. It tends to hit your interest. It makes getting more finance in the future more difficult. A lot of people want to protect their creditworthiness, and so they want to go other routes to deal with these liquidity challenges that they face. And that, of course, can be a whole host of things. But importantly, more concessional finance, more aid, more grants are really important. And of course, the domestic side as well, domestic resource mobilization. And if you get your institutions right, then potentially private investment will come and help with financing too. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm Robert. So since we're on debt, could we just scoot right over to you, Gail, and then we'll get to Dan and Priya.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Where to start? I'll start with Janine because I agree with her. I think SIDS have done a lot. And so the international community also has to do its part. And I think in response to the question, is there a debt crisis? I think, look, my core message is to build a climate-friendly, climate-resilient, high-skill, competitive economy of the future. That cannot happen under a business-as-usual financing scenario that we currently have. It's just not possible. So that, in my view, is a crisis. And if we actually look at the projections of debt service, looking forward over the next 5 years to 2030, the SDG deadline, those projections of debt service in many cases are only continuing to rise. So again, whether it's a debt crisis per se, it is a crisis because the financing is not there. And what I would also say is that debt cancellation, comprehensive debt cancellation, multilateral debt, bilateral debt, all official creditors actually wouldn't cost that much, but the benefits to SIDS would be huge in terms of augmenting their fiscal space very quickly, very rapidly, and very effectively. And I think, Robert talked about debt restructuring being very costly, and so countries try to avoid it at all cases. If they can at the moment, and there's definitely a lot of truth to that. And I think that was one of the reasons behind why we proposed in the paper this automatic mechanism, so that in the event of a qualifying economic shock, there would actually be built into all multilateral and bilateral debt an ex-ante automatic debt cancellation mechanism for debt service for 3 or 5 years, not just deferred down the line, but that's cancelled. It would not be costly because it's automatic. And because it's automatic, it wouldn't trigger negative market reactions, which some market access SIDS might be concerned about. So it really should be a win-win. And again, the costs versus the benefits, in my view, are very, very high. But obviously that is just, I think, a very small part of a solution, and that some countries will require more comprehensive debt cancellation. And so I think let's join our heads together, Tumasi and others, and see what we can propose. I think a lot of creditors want to know, how much is it going to cost us and how much is it going to cost them, and where does the burden fall relative to each other. So I think there can be definitely some more technical work carried out now. But just very quickly on debt swaps, because there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for the mechanism. A lot of rhetoric at the moment. We need to scale up debt swaps. Debt for climate swaps can help reduce debt, close climate financing gaps. There have been some good initiatives in Belize, Barbados, Ecuador recently. I think Antigua and Barbuda is a really interesting case in this regard because it is in some substantial arrears to some of its Paris Club creditors and has expressed an interest in a debt for climate swap with some of its Paris Club creditors, who in turn have said, oh, well, you absolutely have to have an IMF program in place before we'll consider negotiating a debt swap. And it's these kinds of rules which I think don't help anyone. And that, look, at the end of the day, what matters is that funds freed up by the debt swap are spent in ways that help build climate resilience and a climate-friendly economy rather than the prerequisite of having an IMF program in place. So let's go beyond that and say now is the time to actually do that. If we are going to propose debt swaps as a credible solution on the table, then we actually have to sort of be a bit more flexible all round. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So Priya and then Dan.
Thank you for the comments and questions. I'll respond to the question on capitalizing on AI, and in responding to that, I would go into some of the case studies. Just to say that SIDS are doing a lot, and I think among SIDS, we do not know what we're doing. It's far less for letting the international community know what we're doing. And one of the objectives of this paper was really to highlight the best practice case studies that SIDS are doing. With that being said, these best practices need to be scaled up quickly, and we need technical capacity and financing to do that. In terms of some of the best practices with AI, in the Maldives, AI has now allowed for the continuous monitoring of coral growth and restoration. So the Maldives now has the largest artificial reef restoration project in the world. So before, data collection would have been one-off, AI has now allowed for continuous monitoring of coral growth. Similarly, Dominica has stated that it wants to become the world's first disaster resilient country. Again, it's using AI to monitor disaster data to implement early warning systems, whether it's seismic activity or rainfall or hurricane activity, and AI is again allowing for this. Another example in the Maldives, looking at tourism, we have some of the hotels are using cameras placed in garbage bins, and these cameras are now picking up food waste. So the cameras would look at food disposed by hotel guests, and this information would now allow the hotels to determine what foods guests prefer, so that they reduce food waste by preparing on the menu what the visitors are more likely to want. Similarly, for temperature cooling of the room, using of artificial intelligence to reduce energy use and energy conservation. We also have, in terms of the agriculture sector, we have AI being used to connect value chains. In Barbados, we have the Bluefish Initiative, where they're connecting the fishermen to the consumers so that they have access to fresh fish. Similarly, in Fiji, for agriculture, they're using digital platforms to sell their products internationally, to leverage value chains, to gain international certificates for exporting of their products, etc. Yes, I'll leave it there in terms of those examples. The point is we need to highlight these examples and, of course, scale them up.
Thank you, Priya. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Okay. Series of questions. I'll try and keep my answers brief because I know we're running out of time. I won't add much more to the AI one. I suppose the only thing I'll add there is in terms of certainly the digital nomad visa, the potential there, I think it does exist to attract kind of footloose workers in to support the development of those kind of tech, you say leapfrogs, the kind of augmentation of those of capacity and so on, in a way that could strategically really benefit and work alongside the other things that are going on there. So the other things that we talked about, to answer your question around the sovereignty sales and what percentage of that 100 billion will be for SIDS. I'm just looking at my notes here. I haven't got that here. I can double check that. Certainly, it's a really interesting question because on the one hand, The industry is growing quite rapidly in many places. There's real tension within the EU providers, where we've seen a closure of a lot of schemes in recent years. Certain schemes continuing, such as in Cyprus, but other ones starting to come on stream. There's quite a contested space. I think the real change is coming with some of the new emergent markets, such as Turkey, really kind of capitalizing upon their kind of geopolitical location and connections to investors from Eastern Europe. So I think the really interesting part here, I suppose, for SIDS in particular, is what's going to happen to this market share? What's going to happen to their market share of this? Are they going to be squeezed out by new providers, new offers from other parts of the world? That's going to jeopardize not necessarily the longer term sustainability of these schemes, but even the shorter term viability of them. That's one of the key challenges here. And what's the space in there to be really innovative and creative in thinking about how to provide an offer that recognizes the diversity of investors, whether they're looking for educational routes for their children, whether they're looking for healthcare, whether they're looking for retirement, whether they're looking for economic benefits and so on. And one of the, I think, weaknesses of sovereignty schemes or kind of citizenship and residency investment schemes to date has been generally an assumption that all investors are looking for very similar kinds of things. And I think actually there's quite a lot of variety there. We're seeing that in a lot of the research that's coming through at the moment. Claudia, I have a name for sovereignty sales. We had to find something catchy. It's worked. It's got everyone talking about it. I agree it's not perfect, and we'll continue to work on a better term, but it's trying to get beyond just looking at citizenship by investment schemes or economic citizenship schemes and incorporating this broader thing. But I take your point entirely. I'll be honest, I didn't quite catch when you said there's a link between something for investment. I didn't quite catch that term. So perhaps we can catch up over the break and I can respond to you then. Yeah.
Thank you.
Foreign direct investment. Oh, sorry, foreign direct investment. Thank you. Sorry, I was making notes and I just didn't quite catch it. I'm not aware of a direct link between the two. I mean, certainly providers of schemes have used it as a source to generate foreign direct investment. Again, I'll need to go back and check the database we've got and see what the exact relationship is. So I can get back to you on that one for sure. And then I'll just finally pick up on Jenny's points around the kind of legacies of previous experience. And I guess your point there, it's about kind of what more could the international community do? I think the starting point for that, as it is kind of one of the recommendations in the document we've written, is for the international community to recognise that the necessity of these schemes has largely been driven by the international kind of economic structures and so on that's led to a need for the small island states to diversify economies. So should they be doing more? I think they could do more in terms of the creation of things, but a lot of those concerns that the international community has, I think there needs to be a kind of a recognition that those concerns may exist, but they're driven by a set of interests that have a much greater structural set of things that need engaging with. I've not phrased it as well as I could do, but yes, I think there's a need to recognise that international concerns exist, but they exist because they've created a problem that then leads to this kind of, I won't say solution, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Dan. And just to highlight an important comment from one of our listeners online, Patricia Northova. She said, although the papers presented today offer very interesting recommendations, there was no attempt to look at the recommendations in the context of climate scenarios, and that this should be a core concern for our explorations of future options. So this is just something to think about, and for our consultants to weave this into their final papers before we turn them into working papers and put them online. And so just to wrap up, we had a very, very interesting discussion. So thank you to all our panelists and everyone who asked questions. What we've learned, some of it is that inter-SIDS learning is critical. We should try to learn from each other. And I think this is where the Center of Excellence and the Data Hub will come in. So other countries should learn from the Maldives in how they are using AI. We've learned that sovereignty sales, that the name doesn't truly represent what it is and what it should do. So this definitional issue needs to be addressed going forward. And finally, very critically, it sounds as if we need to define what a debt crisis is. And this is probably the first step in actually addressing it by knowing what it characterizes. So Thank you very much, everyone, for your attentiveness, and the panelists for your interest in our presentations. And we'll just have a quick break before we have the next session.
So we're going to move on to session 2. We're going to move on to session 2. Can everyone take their seats, please?
We need a gong.
Yeah. There she is. She's there. So the next session is on safe and prosperous societies. And I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's chairing the session. And we have our speakers and our respondent lined up. And one of our speakers is going to be presenting online, but I'll hand over to Matt to introduce them. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So we've started maybe 10 minutes late for this session, but that's not really a problem because we've got 2 papers rather than 3. So hopefully it won't keep us too long from lunch. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce this session on safe and prosperous societies. The kind of underpinning question which we've distilled from the outcome document, the draft outcome document for the SIDS 4 conference, is how can SIDS generate better health outcomes, improve the quality of public institutions, achieve gender equality, empower youth, and leave nobody behind. We're going to begin with a virtual presentation from Sarah Peck, who's an academic at the University of Northumbria in the United Kingdom. And Sarah's talking about civil society. Hi, Sarah. Can you hear us?
Yep, thanks, Matt. I can hear you. Hopefully you can see my screen okay there.
We can.
Oops, great.
Take it away.
Thanks very much, Matt, for the introduction. Good morning, afternoon and evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, although sorry I couldn't be with you in New York. So this working paper, co-authored with Daniel Hammett, who's in the room with you in New York, aims to think about expanding and strengthening civil society for inclusion, equity and empowerment in small island developing states. And I think firstly, it's crucial to recognise that civil society remains really important for global development, but not only in SIDS, but around the world is under increasing threat from multiple sources, including changes in the civic landscape and also increasing restrictions in financial and social resources. Yet it's also really important to remember that civil society is very much alive and increasingly crucial in the fight for social and environmental justice. And I suppose the key question that we wanted to pose today is how can civic space be expanded and strengthened for greater inclusion, equity and empowerment in SIDS? And within the working paper, we considered what approaches have been used previously to try and strengthen civil society. And reviewing this kind of enormous body of literature suggested that there's been 3 approaches that fall into really 3 different categories. Firstly, around supporting the development of different networks. Secondly, about building capacity. And thirdly, around supporting youth organising. And I'll just consider each of these very briefly in turn.
Sarah, sorry, before you go on, can you just put your PowerPoint into presentation mode? Because we can't see you on the screen. I think if you go into presentation mode, it should pop you up, hopefully. Is that working?
Let me just try. Hang on a sec.
No worries. If it doesn't work, we can just crack on. The joys of modern technology.
If I may, Matt, she needs to click on the bottom right. There is like a little icon. You know, the first one
yep,
from...
okay, I've got it.
Yes,
Is that
that's it.
better?
Yeah, but We still can't see you, but don't worry, just carry on.
Okay.
We can hear you, that's all that
A
matters.
headless voice, okay. So network development. And what tends to happen is that we've seen from the evidence that networks can draw together voices and different resources. But we also know that networks can suffer from internal competition between different actors and challenges around hierarchies of power, and also some challenges overcoming cultural differences and practical concerns. The literature on capacity building tends to focus on individual organisations. So, for example, how programmes might work to develop project management skills or build the skills for policy and advocacy work. Whereas we know less attention is paid to building the capacity of the wider civic landscape. What we also know is that evaluating the effectiveness of any capacity building approach can be really challenging. And finally, if we consider support for youth organising, we know that youth movements and civic participation have a long-standing history in many SIDS. There's been more recent focus on higher level spaces of participation, which whilst these offer opportunities, they also are accompanied by risks of professionalising youth engagement. So just moving on to think about some of these recommendations about how we can really nurture civil society within SIDS. And our first recommendation revolves around the potential of cross-SIDS network building. And it's really want to stress the importance of learning from and reflecting on past initiatives here. And the fact that any cross-SIDS network should be designed collaboratively with civil society actors. It's also, I think, really important to think about the potential for digital technologies to support civic mobilisation. Our second recommendation focuses on capacity building for critical voices. And it feels like questions remain about spaces for more critical or progressive voices, and that a capacity building programme to support these voices is really crucial for transformative change. And our final recommendation considers youth organising and the importance of programmes of work being driven by the youth, not for the youth. This might include the development of programmes of work that support youth in being active kind of citizens or civic beings, rather than the provision of spaces in which they are consulted. It also feels important to consider the civic environment in which young people operate and the different factors that may be constraining their activities. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Matt.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Thank you very much. We can see you again now. Okay, we're just going to pass over to Jose now, who's going to be talking about governance questions.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Well, I would like to start by saying that today we have heard so many about partnerships, collaboration, and I would like to tell you that I come especially from a country that was born to be environment. When it got its independence in 1975, many were those who expected the country to fall shortly after it got its freedom from the former colonizer, Portugal. But today, what we know is that Cape Verde has been considered a development story in Africa. Cape Verde and the SIDS in general, they stand today at the crossroad, as they are extremely vulnerable to external shocks. SIDS are also plagued by financial, natural, and human resources, which make them, turn their development process even more challenging. So SIDS development is yet plagued, as I said, by these administrative failures. And it's interesting that since the first SIDS conference in 1994, and the SIDS key policy documents, Barbados Program of Action, Mauritius Strategy, and the Samoa Pathway, all committed to take concrete actions to implement collaborative governance structures as a key strategy to address and eventually overcome the development challenges in SIDS. But as we gather here today, it's a fact that concrete actions to implement wide-scale governance structures are still missing, which also widened the gap, what they call the missing links or the missing middle between government and society in SIDS. And we all agree that sustainable development is everyone's business. And the question is, how do we bring everyone into this business? The research that I have been conducting proposes a creative or an integrated collaborative governance structures, which are institutional mechanisms that are inclusive, engaging all the social actors in the policy process at the community, municipality, island and national, regional, and also global SIDS. And why do these structures matter for SIDS development? Well, they cater for the inclusive policy process, the needs of all social actors and segments across country and across SIDS. And above all, they strengthen what has been called institutional social capital that is so vital to prevent against policy capture. And also by bringing all the social actors together, all the segments of society together, the findings indicate that SIDS countries where these collaborative governance structures are in place, they have shown a better capacity to mobilize both internal and external resources, that they're better or their productivity capacity is much higher, and their government efficiency is also much higher, and they are much more able to deal with their vulnerabilities and so promote sustainable development, whether it be economic, social, or environmental. And a final question is, what actions need to be taken so that integrated collaborative governance structures work for SIDS development? Well, SIDS individually and as a group, they must first seek a comprehensive policy reform of policy power decentralization across countries in order to leverage CSOs, private sectors, and also bring together international organizations in the policy process. And nationally, SIDS must create and institutionalize multi-level platforms of development, as I said, going down from the community up to global SIDS, and provide them with stability, predictability regarding their action plans, finance, rather than being subjected to political contingencies. Nevertheless, these platforms of development, they do need full support and endorsement from their governments, whether it be local governments or national governments. And also, as it been said earlier, SIDS should establish cross-SIDS network of platforms for their development, which will function as forums for exchanging experiences, practices, and also learning. So these platforms would be learning communities that will work for providing SIDS with insights regarding their developments. And finally, this platform's agenda should align with SIDS' key development priorities. I would like to finish by quoting George Bernard Shaw, who once said that life isn't about finding ourselves, but life is about creating ourselves. And bringing this into SIDS context development, I would say that SIDS sustained development is about creating. We have talked so much about our challenges, but the question is, what solutions are we creating to deal with these challenges? And based on the research findings, I do believe that integrated collaborative governance framework is part of this solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. So we're going to go over to Ambassador Tanya Romualdo from Cape Verde, who's going to give us the response.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening for those who are on the platform. All protocol observed. Allow me to start by expressing my appreciation for the invitation to attend this first SIDS forum, Future Forum, and to be given the honor to do this presentation on the session on safe and prosperous societies. The forum brings together multiple stakeholders to assure a holistic approach to the challenges posed to SIDS populations all over the world and prepare for the upcoming 4th SIDS conference in Antigua and Barbuda next May. Not next week, we would be in trouble. We are not ready yet. We commend the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiatives, RESI, for commissioning policy-focused research papers on key areas, thematic areas, as outlined in the draft outcome document for SIDS 4, and hope that this forum will help us focus on the delivery of an ambitious and implementable outcome. On the topic under appreciation, we just had 2 excellent presentations on interlinked and complementary topics that provided us with multiple visions on how to achieve balanced and sustainable SIDS development and growth through effective partnership involving multiple stakeholders. SIDS are a special case due our unique, inherent, and particular vulnerabilities. Most SIDS are facing slower than expected recovery from the impacts of COVID, and they are also suffering food and energy crisis and the dramatic increase in the cost of living caused by major geopolitical conflicts, together with the adverse impact of climate change, biodiversity loss, and digital divide. Both presentations underline that the challenges are huge and governments cannot face them by themselves. Only a comprehensive, inclusive, and integrated approach will enable SIDS to undertake major transformations for economic growth and development towards achieving resilient prosperity by 2034. The main priorities are enhancing the productive capacities, strengthening social contracts for the well-being of our populations, and guarantee access to existing financing mechanisms for development, climate adaptation, and building resilience. The importance of partnerships between all stakeholders was underlined in Barbados' action plan, picked up again in the Mauritius strategy, and the Samoa pathway. Unfortunately, the 3 documents also share the lack of coherent follow-up and monitoring. SIDS 4 conference should define a collaborative governance as a strategy and tool to strengthen government's ability to make and enforce rules to deliver services. It clearly increases the mobilization of resources, expertise, and skills from a wide range of public and private stakeholders involved in the long-term process of development and more immediately in the accomplishment of the SDGs by 2030. States and governments, local authorities and social actors, academic experts and researchers, private sector and civil society organizations, including NGOs, independent media, human rights defenders, climate activists, labor organizations, grassroots, and community-based organizations must act together to achieve the common goals. Although the harsh conditions inherent to SIDS also affect civil society. The latter is very much aware of the challenges ahead. Civil society is conscious of its own power and knows it has a positive impact on good governance. SIDS civil society also plays an important role in the relation with SIDS diasporas, maintaining a bond that reverts through the remittances, slowly growing steady investment in home country, and the return of brains to motherland. Inclusion, equity, and empowerment should therefore be nurtured at all levels due its importance for a balanced, inclusive, and sustainable development and growth of SIDS. This brings me to another important aspect highlighted in the theme of this session, the empowerment of women and youth, and how they can contribute for better health outcomes and SIDS sustainable development. Can I make a parenthesis on something that was not mentioned? Thank you. So women's unusual decision-making power in SIDS and elsewhere undermines development at every level. It is therefore urgent to build fully inclusive, resilient communities with a primary focus on women. The promotion and full realization of human rights of women and girls will increase women's leadership, participation, and representation in decision-making, and increase their access to economic opportunities, education, and healthcare. Health issues represent a serious threat to sustainable development and economic productivity. SIDS need to accelerate integration of the climate health nexus into policymaking, strengthen national and regional health systems, enhance capacity building, upgrading infrastructure and equipment in the field of public health. Women play a crucial role in the sector, including in dealing with mental health, promoting healthy lifestyles, and providing preventive care, especially for children and youth easily exposed to substance abuse. Women play a major role as professionals in the sector, but also as main educators in their communities and as heads of monoparental families in many SIDS countries where men continue to emigrate, seeking better life conditions for their families. On the other hand, youth empowerment is also vital because of the role they play in sustainable development and their full, effective, and meaningful participation in society. So SIDS needs to adopt policies and strategies aimed at reducing unemployment and underemployment by promoting skills development and productivity, technology transfer, and experience sharing that respond to evolving job markets, reducing barriers to employment, and reduce the digital divide, especially for youth. On the above, I would like to mention a simple, easy, implementable recommendation: the creation of both a SIDS Women Network and the SIDS Youth Network. Now back to the presentations. That was my parenthesis. Very short. I would like to briefly underline the recommendations made, starting by Professor Sarah Peck, on how civil society can be nurtured in SIDS context. She underlined the importance of a cross-SIDS network designed collaboratively with civil society actors and that could provide learning from and reflecting on past initiatives. It also represents a potential for digital technologies to support civic mobilization. On capacity building for critical voices, questions remain about spaces for more critical or progressive voices within the SIDS environments. A capacity building program to support these voices is crucial for transformative change. On youth, the presentation by Professor Sarah, highlighted the importance of programs of work driven by youth, not designed for youth. development of a program of work that supports youth in being active civic beings, rather than the provision of spaces in which they can be consulted. Also important to think about the civic environment in which young people operate, in particularly aspects that might be constraining their activities. Now moving over to the Professor José Maria Gomes Lopes' strategic recommendations, he underlined the need to undertake a comprehensive reform of policy power decentralization process, a bottom-up approach of the integrated collaborative governance framework, starting at community level and then growing into municipality, island, national, region, and global networks of platforms for development requires their institutional endorsement at all levels. And finally, it was also underlined the strong need for alignment of those platforms of development with SIDS priorities. Thank you for your attention.
So we've had two very, very interesting papers, a wonderful reflection there. I'm very keen to open to the floor. If I could just remind people before you speak to introduce yourselves for the benefit, not just of those of us in the room, but the many people that are listening online as well. Hello, Janine, please.
Thank you very much. Sarah, my name is Janine Felsen. I'm from Belize. I've introduced myself before. Thank you very much for the presentation, and couldn't agree more with what the ambassador just said about the importance of women in decision-making processes and women leadership. She's an example. There are many examples in SIDS of women, female prime ministers. I can speak to the Caribbean, who have made their mark internationally. My colleague from Barbados sits next to me, and we all know the incredible power that Prime Minister Motley has had in discussions internationally. I did want to pick up an issue on civil society. Very important partners overall in development. Partners, they're not just advocate, they're partners, but they can also be very instrumental in leveraging opportunities for financing. But civil society in the well, I can speak again from the Caribbean experience, civil society, non-state actors, NGOs, they suffer with the ability to actually fund their activities. And that's significant. I sit on two different boards, one national and one interregional. And one of the challenges is that whilst it's possible to get projectized funding, that funding never goes to actually building capacity. So that's a really big challenge for anyone working within the space to ensure that there is further empowerment of civil society. And it'd be interesting to know what your research has uncovered. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I think the ambassador at the back.
Ambassador Tony from Tonga. I'd like to thank you, Matt, for coordinating or chairing our session here, and thank Professor Peck and Mr. Lopez for the presentations, and of course the response from Ambassador Tanya from Cabo Verde. My comment, and maybe a lead up to a question perhaps, is with regards to outer islands in my own country, Tonga. Of course, in many of our regions, whether it's A's or Pacific Island countries or Caribbean, our configuration is that we are island archipelago, many islands. And of course, when you talk about a lot of these issues, many things sit well in our capitals and in the main islands where infrastructure are much better and so forth. But I'm captured by, towards the end of the theme here, leaving no one behind. And I can think of the long theme of the CSW 68, which is coming up in a week or so. It's about what? Accelerating the attainment of gender equality and empowerment of women by addressing poverty and also strengthening the institutions and financing with a gender perspective. It's a long theme, but it does capture many good things about poverty, financing, institutions, and so forth, and accelerating the process. I'm thinking about the outer islands, and I'm thinking about, leaving no one behind. And one thing that I can think of is renewable energy. We talk a lot about development, of course, our capitals and have the infrastructure. But I think about the remote islands in the case of Tonga, and I'm sure in the case of the other regions, how that we should give attention to renewable energy. You can't move everybody to the main islands. People have their independence. They want to live in these islands. And if we want to pursue leaving no one behind, renewable energy would be one factor. And I think Tomasi captured this in his very elaborate presentation, and maybe some of the other presentations. But I would subscribe to the notion of investment on renewable energy on the outer islands, so that we, when we talk about society and leaving no one behind, and whether it's CSO, I think we need to capture this and keep that in the forefront of our mind. Paying attention to the outer islands, I think renewable energy would be one way of addressing this issue. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ambassador Tone. I can see Karuna and then the gentleman here, if that's okay. Karuna's at the end here, Rashid.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Karuna Rana, and I'm from the Big Ocean State Initiative from Mauritius. So I wanted to respond to the presentation from Dr. Sarah Peck, and also to Tanya, who was the respondent. And that has to do specifically with the issue of youth participation. So what I want to present is more of a case study. I don't know if you're aware, but around 10 years ago, young people were brought together by UNICEF, UNESCO, and some other partners right before all the regional SIDS conferences. And one of the outcomes of the AIS region consultation with young people was exactly that we don't have anything that brings us together as a region, unlike Caribbean and the Pacific. And I know, Margot, you mentioned that as well, having an AIS mechanism. So we set up, because I'm also one of the co-founders of SIA, that's what we set up, which was directly an outcome linked to the last SIDS conference. And SIA, which is the SIDS Youth ACE Hub, has been bringing young people together across the AIS region, except for Singapore. We have country-based hubs, and I think it's a great case study to see what engaging young people early on can lead to, but also what does a youth by youth initiative, a for youth by youth initiative, what are the outcomes they can lead to as well. But it also presents, challenges and a lot of other things, because it's been a 10-year journey. So there have been a lot of successes, but also a lot of challenges, and there's a lot to learn from it. And even though we are not like the official AIS mechanism, but at least there is something for us to start on. And lastly, you also mentioned about the SIDS Youth Network. Even if I'm not involved in the youth space as much as actively as I was before, I'm aware that the young people are coming together to propose to build a SIDS Youth Network, because there's going to be a SIDS Youth Forum before that. So I'm aware that they are working on that. And so this was I think it would be a good case study to consider. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karuna. Rashid, just down here. Yep.
Thank you so much. Duarte Valente from the Permanent Mission of Portugal, the ex-colonizer. now today a good partner. I know we do a lot of great work together with the colleagues from Cabo Verde. No, just a couple of notes. First of all, thanks a lot for the organization of the event. I think that the discussion and the papers that have been circulated have been very useful. I'm only sad that this has not taken place before the negotiations started, in which we are very active, ourselves, Portugal, negotiating on behalf of the EU. I'd like to thank the ambassador of Cabo Verde for the parentheses on the reference to the importance of the empowerment of women and girls and their role in decision making. This is something where we see eye to eye. Also the reference, the ideas, the concrete initiatives that have been proposed. Again, negotiations are now well underway and we're not putting forward new language, but I think that a lot of good proposals have been made and are currently under consideration on the table. And so we certainly look forward to seeing to strengthen the text as much as possible based on what's already there. Also, a note on what the ambassador of Tonga said, again, also on gender equality, but of course on renewables, very important issue for us as well. We have experiences to share. We know that this is very important for SIDS, so hope also to continue on that based on the outcome document. And that is really it. Just wanted to say a piece on these things. So thanks again.
Fantastic. Do we have anybody else wanting to come in? Hand up? Yep.
Thank you very much, Claudia LaRue from the Dominican Republic Permanent Mission. And thank you to all the presenters, because this has definitely been food for thought, especially Ambassador Tanya's comments and parentheses as well. I would, if I could be allowed, could I respond to Ambassador Tom's comment?
Of course.
Because what he said, a light bulb hit in my head. The Dominican Republic actually owns an island called La Isla Saona, and it runs 100% on renewable energy. And this is the local communities and the youth and the women's organizations are very much involved. So this is definitely a success story that we can share. So yes, there's good stuff happening when it comes to leaving no one behind and renewable energy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Anybody else? Oh, sorry, I apologize, Kalan.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment.
Introduce yourself. Sorry, Kalan, for the benefit of everybody else.
Yes,
Thanks.
I am Kalan Blackman, an independent consultant from Barbados, and thank you so much for your presentations. I would just like to comment on the women in trade and youth involvement. Just before I came here, I was part of a session put on by Caribbean Women in Trade, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of these groups. And sometimes it things that we can do for ourselves within our countries and expand them. Because although we have the local groups within Barbados, we still expand within the Caribbean, and those networks, they really make a difference in terms of bridging the gap between the youth, between those who have gone before them and learning from, those who have gone before them about examples and things that they can do that can really make a difference. So it's like fast tracking our development because you would have learned from those who would have gone before. So I don't want us to leave this room thinking that things like that are difficult, because it started with a small group, but we are expanding because we see the importance of these initiatives, and it's been really making a difference in terms of development and empowering women. Because when you look at the statistics as well, a lot of women are involved in small businesses, but they don't have the guidance. And sometimes the guidance is there, is just knowing where it's located and how to tap into it. So I really applaud highlighting these initiatives, and we can definitely learn from each other and work together to make this possible. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karlan. If there's nobody else, I might just very briefly abuse the chair's position before I go back to the authors. The question that came to my mind when listening to both presentations was about the kind of cross-SIDS institutional strengthening that was kind of explicit in Sarah's presentation and more implicit in Jose's, but it's there as well. So I guess the question I'm interested in is, what does cross-SIDS institutional strengthening look like? What mechanisms might facilitate it? And how might that connect to some of the kinds of things that are proposed by the government of Antigua and Barbuda and the SIDS stakeholder community as a whole in the outcome document? Okay. All right. Well, we'll hand straight over to Sarah, if that's okay, to respond to some of the points that have been raised.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt, and thank you to everyone for your comments and questions. I'll try and sort of address them in the order that they were raised. Janine, thank you very much for your points. Yeah, very much agree about all the conversation around gender and women's empowerment and women's leadership. Turning to the sort of question of funding, yes, I very much agree. I think one of the key things that comes through in a lot of the literature on civil society and in mine and Dan's own work is the struggles around funding and civil society really feeling sort of almost left out and left behind with different funding processes. You mentioned the sort of emphasis on projects without the funding there to sustain organisations beyond those projects, or to sustain staffing beyond those projects. And there's certainly been quite a lot of literature around sort of damage in the way that, I guess, international donor funding predominantly has been directed towards civil society, and how that has shaped the sector in maybe not always the most positive of ways, I suppose. So I think I completely agree with what you're saying, that, and I think civil society groups would say that funding is one of their major struggles. I think we're starting to see initiatives that are looking to sort of slightly challenge the traditional model of funding. So looking at different ways of, for example, monitoring and evaluation, looking at funding organisations over on a more longer term basis rather than on a project to project basis. And I guess the other thing that I would say, I think that civil society organisations, whilst being, I think, very frustrated by, the sort of the way they find themselves with funding, there's also a lot of initiatives going on there around diversifying their own funding models. So certainly in the research that I've been involved in, we saw civil society organisations turning towards crowdfunding, towards social enterprise models, towards different ways of leveraging funds that maybe made them less reliant on the sort of vagaries of the international donor kind of architecture. And whilst those, I think those are, potentially a positive change, they're also unstable and make civil society organisations vulnerable in different ways, I think. So I think caution needs to be thought of when thinking about those kind of alternative funding mechanisms. But yes, certainly funding, I think, is a key concern for organisations. Just turning to Ambassador Toda's points, yes, and I think thinking about sort of those more remote islands. Just, I know we were talking about in the context of renewable energy, but also in the context of civil society is really important. And thinking about how the sort of inequalities of civil society across different archipelagos is important as well, and how we can bring civil society organisations on more remote islands, how they can be connected up into these initiatives is really important as well. Karina, thank you ever so much for your case study and your points. That sounds like a really fantastic initiative, and something that is youth driven and youth centred rather than being constructed for the youth. This is actually driven by the youth, and it sounds as if that's the sort of thing that is really important to continue to support and really build on those existing initiatives that are being successful. And I think, like you were saying, obviously over that kind of 10-year journey, there's lots to learn and lots to reflect on through initiatives like that. And I think the more that we can draw on previous experiences and initiatives, the better. And then I think the final sort of question, or there's a couple of questions directed towards me. Carla Ann, yes, I think those networks and expanding those different networks is really crucial. In some of the research I've done, some of the civil society organisations described kind of regional networks as just this university without walls, their opportunity for solidarity and camaraderie, and for really strengthening their own position. So I think that those networks are incredibly important, and like you say, can really optimise what civil society organisations are doing. And then moving on just to your point, Matt, what would that cross SIDS institutional strengthening, what that might look like? And I think, I don't necessarily have, I don't think, a firm answer for that necessarily, but I think it is about looking at those past initiatives and learning from them, and starting to think about what infrastructures maybe exist already and how those can be expanded and built on. I think there's a lot of potential around the digital platforms, digital innovation to support civic networking and civic mobilisation. But I suppose that always has to be caveated with the limitations of some of that digital engagement, and how those forms of digital technology may produce their own kind of limitations and inequalities in in kind of civic participation as well. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Matt.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thanks so much. Jose.
Thank you, Matt. Working. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Matt, for the comments and also some of the comments that have been made here. We can see that networks, whether they are national or across SIDS, are really important to promote inclusion. You've talked about, the integration of women issues, youth issues, which are really important when we take the principle of not leaving no one behind. And I do believe that having whether national networks or across its nationals will give, these segments of population opportunities to integrate, concerning their needs into the policy process. Regarding your question, Matt, what I've been looking at recently is what sectoral networks are there in place, across SIDS, where you have different actors engaged in sectoral policies in order to share for the countries to share experiences. And one of those networks that I've been looking at is on education. And just to cite the example of the consortium of SIDS universities, I do think that if we have, platforms across different sectors, we will, they will serve as, forums for bringing different people from different countries to share experiences. We do have very good examples, in some of the SIDS, and I do think that we need to have space where we can share, where we can learn. Somebody said in the morning that, for instance, in the AIS region, we have kind of lack of policy coordination or coordination between the SIDS themselves. So one thing that we can look at is not only, governmental organizations, corporations, but creating platforms where not only governments, but also civil society, private sector can come together to discuss SIDS development issues and perhaps contribute with insightful ideas that can help SIDS overcome these challenges. Thank you.
Okay. We've still got 5 minutes or so for this session. If anybody's got any other interventions they'd like to make. James? James, who knows something about cross SIDS institutional platforms.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. James Ellsmore from Island Innovation. And I wanted to reflect on that was highlighted about the importance of regional and pan-SIDS initiatives for civil society. I think especially in the smaller countries where there is a need for connections to neighboring countries or other countries in SIDS regions, and able to reinforce the work of civil society because of the need to share expertise between SIDS. And also sometimes when there is conflict within those countries, the need for regional backup, for want of a better word, for those organizations. But we've reflected on the importance of those regional or pan-SIDS networks. But I also wanted to point out the lack of funding for initiatives that is pan-SIDS. I think when there is funding, it's maybe focused on the Caribbean region or the Pacific region. But it's very rare to see funding that works for programs that works across all of those SIDS. And I think Karuna's point about the AIMS region specifically is the one of the three regions that, in my opinion, really suffers from that due to the linguistic, cultural, geographical and various other barriers that region has when compared to the Caribbean and the Pacific, both of which benefit from the regional infrastructure in those regions. I wanted to mention one program that we organized, the Caribbean Climate Justice Leadership Academy, where we were able to take 10 young people from the Caribbean region to COP in Dubai, which really provided a lot of value for those young people to be able to participate in those networks. And I think it's we were able to connect those young people with other young people from the Pacific region, where there are similar types of programs. And again, I would say it was the Ames region that has the specific lack of funding when compared to the other two regions. But just to emphasize that point, that I think it would be interesting to look at when funding can be organized in a way that can work across all of the different SIDS regions, because that is rarely the case. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. So I'll take the opportunity just to sum up now. I think there are 5 broad things that I've taken from that excellent conversation just now. The first one is the perennial problem of funding. We need more money. Civil society needs more support. It's already doing a great job by all accounts of trying to diversify its own funding sources on a kind of individual organizational level. But in an absence of greater support, it's very, very difficult for civil society organizations to connect within their own countries, let alone within their regions, let alone collectively at the international level. And that funding more broadly, if it can be, should be more programmatic and a bit less projectified, I think was the word that was used. Maybe we need to find ways to think about when projects have been successful, how we keep them sustainable. The second point is that it sounds to me like there's an awful lot going on in this space, and that civil society has actually been exceptionally successful at generating a huge amount of impactful work over time. But one of the problems, again, a perennial problem, is that we haven't consolidated those lessons. We don't have repositories of information where those lessons are retained, or the information about them is retained. We have bits of academic and other kinds of research on different things that are happening, but we need a more kind of consolidated understanding of what is working, what hasn't worked, that we can then use to shape future kinds of action. I think the third point is that we need to think, as feminist scholars would call it, we need to think intersectionally about these problems. And this is a question of gender, most obviously, but it's also a question of class in some places. Certain people are going to feel the effects of climate change and other crises more than other groups. We need to think about demography. So we need to think about youth, obviously, but I think perhaps we need to think about older people as well, as much as we do younger people. We need to think about race, perhaps, in some places as well, which is often quite a difficult conversation to be had. And we also need to think about islandness. It's been really fascinating and important for me to hear about the kind of importance and the challenges that are faced by outlying islands in archipelagic states. The fourth issue, the fourth theme that comes out of this conversation for me is the need to bring the AES region into these conversations more squarely. And I think there's a huge amount of work that we could perhaps support with at RESI in terms of trying to facilitate stronger conversations between Caribbean colleagues, Pacific colleagues, and those elsewhere. And then the final one, and I think this is kind of a wider underpinning point, is that we need to think very much about how we bring civil society into these processes as active participants, to use the ambassador's phrase, rather than as kind of consultees, people just to be asked questions and then forgotten about. And that's going to allow me to give a little plug for tomorrow's Day 2 of the Future Forum, which is entirely focused on civil society participation and will be held online. So for those of you that are interested in these questions and see them as important, it would be great if you could join us for that as well. So thank you very much for a really stimulating second session, everybody. We'll break there for lunch now. I don't know if Emily's got any housekeeping messages.
Yeah, Thanks, Matt. Just to say that we will reconvene at 1:40. Yeah, 1:40. We've got 3 more sessions this afternoon, including the final sort of thematic session on the means of implementation. So that's where a lot of the ideas coming out of the other sessions are going to come together in terms of what we need on sort of finance, technology transfer, data, and so on, to actually advance some of these ideas, and hopefully we can come to some recommendations. So please have some lunch, have a break, and come back refreshed for the discussions after lunch. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.